An invisible enemy threatens our society. Its name? Humanism. Its target? Your mind. Mind, whether most people are aware of it or not, secular humanism, the philosophy that declares, no deity will save us, we must save ourselves, has been quietly woven into the fabric of our daily lives. Yet the danger signs are quite evident. Legislation on the national level reflects widespread acceptance of easy divorce, abortion on demand, gay rights, militant feminism, unisex facilities, and leniency towards pornography, prostitution, and crime. The public school system has demonstrated hostility toward prayer, moral and religious values, creation as an alternative to evolution, and the teaching of sex education within a moral context. A sexually permissive, self-indulgent approach to life has become the norm for movies, books, and even prime-time television. In short, many religious leaders believe that America may very well follow in the footsteps of Sodom and Gomorrah. Continued on Backflap. By Tim LaHaye. How to Win Over Depression _Revelation. I illustrated and made plain 10 steps to victory over depression. How to be happy though married. Beginning of the end. Spirit controlled temperament. Transform temperaments. The act of marriage, with Beverly LaHaye. How to study the Bible for yourself. The Bible's influence on American history. Noah's Ark, The Search Goes On, with John Morris. Understanding the Male Temperament. Spirit Controlled Family Living, with Bev LaHaye. The Unhappy Gay's Life in the Afterlife. The Battle for the Mind. The Battle for the Mind. Tim LaHaye. R.B. Fleming. H. Revell Company, Old Tappan, New Jersey. Unless otherwise indicated, scripture quotations in this volume are from the King James Version of the Bible. Scripture quotations identified NKJV/NT are from the New King James Bible, New Testament. Copyright 1979, Thomas Nelson Incorporated, Publishers. Quotations from Philosophy of Humanism, by Corliss Lamont. Copyright 1949, 1957, 1965 by Corliss Lamont. Reprinted by permission of Frederick Ungar Publishing Company. Material from Humanist Manifestos IN2 was published by Prometheus Books, 1203 Kensington Avenue, Buffalo, New York, and is reprinted by permission. Excerpts from The Sika Circle, by Claire Chambers. Copyright 1977, by Western Island. Used by permission. Excerpts from How Should We Then Live? By Francis A. Schaffer. Copyright 1976 by Francis A. Schaffer. Used by permission. Library of Congress Cataloging in Publication Data. LaHaye, Tim F. The Battle for the Mind. Includes bibliographical references. 1. Apologetics 20th century. 2. Humanism controversial literature. 3. Atheism controversial literature. 4. United States moral conditions. 5. Christianity philosophy. Title. BT 1102.L255 2116 80 to 16832 ISBN 0-8007-1112-2 ISBN 0-8007-5043-8, PBK. Copyright 1980 Tim LaHaye published by Fleming H. Revell Co. All rights reserved. Printed in the United States of America. This book is dedicated to Dr. Francis Schaffer, the renowned philosopher prophet of the 20th century. Although we have never met personally, I have admired him from a distance and greatly respect the enormous contribution his books, movies, seminars, and other teachings have made in the current awakening of our people to the dangers of humanism. I hope his warnings and those in this book are not too late. Contents IEK, Pat on OK Comno Darund equals Introduction. Your Incredible Brain. Humanizing America. The Wisdom of God. Humanism, the wisdom of man. The Humanist Bible. Humanism is unscientific. Humanism is a religion. Humanists control America. The moral majority. The sleeping majority is stirring. Separation of church and state. Is the pre-tribulation tribulation necessary? What you can do. Appendix A, Appendix B. Source notes 13 25 47 37 85 07 125 141 181 197 207 217 225 239 241. Introduction. Scientists call the human mind the most complex living mechanism in the world. It certainly is the most important, for as it goes, so goes the human being. God has given us 4 primary orbs with entrance to the mind, in order to influence it: 2 eyes and 2 ears. What you see and hear influence the thoughts of your mind, and your mind determines your actions. In this world, there are 2 basic lines of reasoning that determine the morals, values, lifestyle, and activities of mankind: the wisdom of man or the wisdom of God. See 1 Corinthians 1:17-25. Today they take the form of atheistic humanism or Christianity. What this life is all about is the battle for your mind, whether you will live your life guided by man's wisdom, humanism, or God's wisdom, Christianity. Either one will affect the way you live and where you spend eternity. Most people today do not realize what humanism really is and how it is destroying our culture, families, country, and one day, the entire world. Most of the evils in the world today can be traced to humanism, which has taken over our government, the UN, education, TV, and most of the other influential things of life. The Church of Jesus Christ is the last obstacle for the humanists to conquer. The 1960s saw the battle for racial rights. In the 1970s, it was sexual rights. But the 1980s have been designated for the battle against religious rights. Unfortunately, at this time of destiny, the church is sound asleep, and unless the 60 million people who George Gallup's poll indicates are Christians wake up to who the enemy really is, the humanists will accomplish their goal of a complete world takeover by the year 2000. I believe there is yet time for us to defeat the humanists and reverse the moral decline in our country that has us on a collision course with Sodom and Gomorrah. I believe God will yet bless this nation and give us another great revival, which I call Great Awakening too. It will only come, however, if we become informed of what humanism is, who the enemy is, and how to fight their subtle form of religious evil. This book is dedicated to explaining humanism in simple terms, so that the man on the street can both understand its danger and be motivated to oppose it at the place it can be defeated: the ballot box. We must remove all humanists from public office and replace them with pro-moral political leaders. The Bible says, "When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice." Proverbs 29:2. This is not a book of gloom, doom, and despair, but a clarion call to saltless Christians to fulfill Dr. Francis Schaeffer's challenge to continue being lights in the world, but also be savoring moral influence in our culture. You will find positive suggestions on what you can do to triumph over this religious evil and help return our country to moral sanity. Note to teachers: for information regarding visual transparencies for use as teaching aids with overhead projection, write to Family Life Seminars, P.O. Box 1299, El Cajon, California 92022. Your brain is the most complex mechanism in the world and the most influential organ of your body. It accounts for your ability to think, remember, love, hate, feel, reason, imagine, and analyze. The principal difference between you and animals, it is one organ without which you cannot sustain life. The average brain, weighing about 3 pounds, contains 12 billion cells, each of which is connected to 10,000 other brain cells, totaling 120 trillion brain connections. No wonder a scientist stated, "The human brain is the most complex arrangement of matter in the universe." Some have compared the human brain to a sophisticated computer, but technology hasn't even come close to duplicating its capabilities. Dr. Gerhard Dirks, who holds 50 patents on the IBM computer, told me that he acquired most of his inventive ideas from studying the functions of the human brain. Commenting on its complexity, he stated, "If we could invent a computer that would duplicate the capabilities of the human brain, it would take a structure the size of the Empire State Building, just to house it. Your brain supervises everything you do, from the involuntary beat of your heart to the conscious decisions of life. It controls hearing, sight, smell, speech, eating, resting, learning, prejudices, and everything else that makes you behave as you do. The characteristics that you inherited at birth, which produce your unique traits, temperament, and even physical growth, are controlled by your brain. We have little or no conscious control over many of these traits, and even today, scientists disagree as to the extent to which we exercise mastery over ourselves. One man I know, who went to his doctor because his heart was racing, discovered that fears in his mind caused his body to simulate a heart attack. By learning to govern his fears, he was able to control his heart. In the case of malfunctioning sight, hearing, or other bodily impairments, it is not so simple, and yet our thoughts and feelings do indeed influence our behavior. The wise writer of Proverbs observed, "As a man thinks in his heart, so is he," see Proverbs 23:7. Most scientists agree that although we cannot consciously control all the functions of our brain, most people could regulate far more of them than they realize. One thing is certain: what you see, what you hear, and the way you think, your philosophy of life, are the most significant influences on your life. The following diagrams illustrate the three most important functions of your brain: your intellect, emotions, and will. These three areas are so interrelated that many people think of them as one. They are, in fact, independent, and as we shall see, your emotions and will are highly influenced by your intellect. Your mind: a major portion of your 1,800-gram brain consists of your intellect, or mind. It, too, is influenced by inherited temperament, accounting for the fact that some people are, by nature, analytical perfectionists, with good retention capabilities, while others are prone to be goal-oriented people lovers, with a tendency to find organization and concentration difficult. We use a file cabinet to symbolize the mind because it is the principal place of memory. From its file you make your deductions, judgments, and decisions. Your mind has phenome, RPNAL potential, which is ALI-YJ, gem most beyond belief. Science QE tests inform us that the average person uses only 10% of his mind's capabilities during his entire lifetime. If that is true, then most people must die with 10 to 11 billion brain cells still unused. The vast majority of data concerning the mind has been discovered during the past 100 years, yet the greatest discoveries, scientists anticipate, will surface in the future. The mind's chief function is that of memory, but it also houses our intuition, conscience, sexuality, and many other things. Recent studies indicate a difference between the brains of men and women, attributing some validity to the traditional observation that they think differently. For example, boys and girls from primitive cultures, unfamiliar with modern toys when introduced to them, responded differently. The boys gravitated to trucks and soldier toys, while the girls were drawn to dishes and dolls. When it comes to learning, the conscious mind, subconscious mind, and imagination are the brain's most significant areas. Apparently everything we see, hear, touch, and smell is recorded on the lobes of our brain, never to be forgotten. Some information, however, remains in our subconscious files and cannot be recalled at will, as can that in the conscious section. That explains why we cannot remember an answer when taking an examination, but before getting home, our eyes may see something that triggers a thought that opens a certain file, causing us to remember. We use a file cabinet, rather than a modern computer to symbolize the mind, because it is easier for everyone to understand how it influences feelings, actions, and will. As we have seen, the two primary means of communicating to your brain are through the eyes and ears. It is difficult to exaggerate the importance of using these receptors properly, for how you employ them largely determines how you think, your philosophy of life. And be sure of this, your philosophy of life will determine the way you live. Actually, Your philosophy is the result of your inherited mind, your training, plus what you have seen, read, done, and heard to this point in your life. Whether we call it a worldview or the way you look at life, nothing but life itself is more important to you than this philosophical position. Your inherited temperament also has a significant influence on your personality, helping to determine the way you do things. For example, if you are an introvert, it is because you were born with an introvert temperament. Although you can become more aggressive than your natural inclinations suggest, you will never be a spontaneous extrovert. However, your philosophy of life, which you adopt on the basis of what you have programmed into your mind through your eyes and ears, determines the way you look at life, and that will affect your morals, work drive, integrity, and life investment. Scientists tell us that the brain is our most important organ because it determines the function of our other organs, such as the pituitary, hypothalamus, heart, nervous system, and so forth. We have little control over the involuntary function of the brain, except to provide it good nutrition, both physically and mentally, upon which to operate. The voluntary part of the brain we do control, however, and that largely consists of the three areas we have discussed: what we see, what we hear, how we think. Ever since God first spoke to Adam and Eve, explaining to them how to think, so they would know how to live successful and happy lives, there has been a consistent battle over who will control the thought processes of man's mind, man or God. Sooner or later, every human being makes that decision, and the result is his philosophy of life. Until this generation, parents were the most influential force in helping a child formulate his philosophy. That is no longer true. Modern technology has found ingenious ways to assault the mind of man and child with incredibly beautiful sounds, colors, and visual imagery. Millions of parents have already lost their children's minds to rock stars, atheistic humanistic educators, sensual entertainers, and a host of other anti-God, amoral, anti-man influences. Since you are what you think, your thought processes today are largely the result of the input that has come to your mind via your eyes and ears. If you are not careful, you will lose the battle for control of your mind and the minds of your children. Emotional center. The second significant part of your brain is your heart, or, as scientists call it, your emotional center. This seat of your emotions is located behind your forehead and between your temples. Rather than being heart-shaped, as romantics tend to visualize it, in reality it is walnut-shaped. Tied neurologically to every organ of your body, it is known as the motor of the body, for it activates both feeling and movement. If your emotional center is disturbed, you will be upset all over. Emotionally induced illness, which according to doctors accounts for 65 to 80% of all modern sickness, originates in the emotions. A person who feels angry, fearful, or tense will suffer all kinds of physical ailments, from high blood pressure and ulcers to strokes and brain damage. One doctor has listed 51 diseases that can be incurred this way. The emotional center is influenced by many factors, beginning with your inherited temperament. That explains why some people are excitable by nature, while others are passive or indifferent. After that, life's experiences, education, beliefs, and most significantly, the mind, influence how we feel. To illustrate the relationship of the mind to the emotions, visualize a man who owns 2,000 shares of AT&T at $1,000 a share. As he reads his morning paper and finds that one share has dropped to $10, how does he feel? He feels angry, depressed, even suicidal. As soon as his mind comprehended the loss of a fortune, it affected his heart, or his emotions. Now visualize the same man as he calls his broker and discovers that the newspaper had made a typographical error. A smile brightens his face, and he feels relieved. The mind is to the emotions what food is to the body. For that reason, what the mind feeds upon becomes the most influential force in your life. One of the great myths of our times is that feelings are spontaneous. Actually, they are created by what you put into your mind. Computer people repeatedly warn, You get out of a computer only what you program into it, or, more crudely stated, garbage in, garbage out. The same can be said for the mind. Whatever the eyes and ears communicate, the mind in turn dispenses. The other senses, smell, taste, and touch, influence our thinking but do not have as significant an impact on our mind. Consider the unmarried, 21-year-old college student who acknowledged a serious problem with sexual thoughts. Realizing that he was at the zenith of his sex drive, I was not surprised by his confession. In an attempt to help him learn to control his emotional passions, I asked, "What have you been reading and seeing lately?" After skirmishing a bit with vague references to newspapers and magazines, he finally acknowledged a more than passing acquaintance with Playboy and certain pornographic books. When pressed about movies, he admitted that he had been watching X-rated movies on cable TV. I pointed out to him that such a large intake of pornography was like pouring gasoline on a fire. The old truism, "You are what you read," could be enlarged to, "You are what you see." What the eyes feast upon forms an impression on the mind, which in turn feeds the emotions. Just as drugs or alcohol influence thoughts and feelings physically, what we see and hear affect our thoughts and emotions. There is growing evidence today that our warnings to civil leaders a few years ago that overturning the moral laws upon which this country was built would increase crimes of sex and violence were fully warranted. In the name of free speech and freedom of the press, we have polluted the minds of our young with pornography until crime and sexual assaults are now commonplace. The problem will not diminish until we elect public officials with sufficient moral sanity to pass laws prohibiting the distribution of corrupting materials. Not only are just our morally minded citizens concerned. A recent demonstration of feminists in New York highlighted their concern that the widespread use of porno is a threat to them, for they become the victims of rape and assaults. Sociologist Marvin Wolfgang has stated, "The weight of evidence now suggests that the portrayal of violence tends to encourage the use of physical aggression among people who are exposed to it." Of course it does. Whatever you see or hear influences your mind, which in turn affects your feelings and your emotional center. Feelings, then, are aroused as much by what you see and hear as by who and what you are. If you want the right feelings, see and hear the right things, so you can generate the right thoughts. Thousands of minors have been taken into custody for crimes that never would have been committed, had it not been for the abuse of porno. I visited a 16-year-old in juvenile hall, after he had committed a sex crime that startled everyone who knew him. In checking his room, we found 2/3 of a drawer filled with pornographic filth. It was easy to understand how this lad brought disgrace upon his family and shame to himself. At a time when he was beginning to experience new sexual passions, he artificially fanned them by the misuse of his eyes, until his emotions were ignited beyond control. He will probably be haunted by that evil action the rest of his life. However, that boy was not abnormal. He simply underwent a natural reaction to an abnormal stimulus. Pornography is abnormal. Our youth seem obsessed with sex because depraved adults are providing them the pornographic fuel with which they are burning up their lives. Admittedly, all visual filth, whether in TV, movies, or books, does not result in crimes of violence. But my counseling experience indicates that it frequently occasions an equally negative effect, reducing the beautiful expression of love in marriage to a sexual expression of passion. In fact, pornography is one of the leading causes of our skyrocketing divorce rate. Pornography, of course, is not the only phenomenon that influences the emotions. I use it as a graphic illustration pointing up that what you see and hear largely influence how you think, and how you think influences your feelings. Here is a healthy rule of thumb to follow: when you recognize wrong or harmful feelings, examine what you have been seeing and hearing lately and how your mind has been thinking. Feelings are not spontaneous. To control them, you must first control your mind. The human will, the third characteristic of the brain, which makes mankind unique from all other living creatures, is the will. No one knows where it is located, but we suspect it resides in the brain, because it is so dependent on the mind and emotions. Besides, many dying people have manifested a strong will long after every other bodily function has terminated. When the brain ceased to function, the will vanished. Like the heart and mind, the will is influenced by a person's inherited temperament, which explains why some people have a weak will, while others by nature are strong-willed. After that, the will is influenced by parental training, education, life experiences, what a person reads, sees, and hears, and the way in which he thinks and feels. Someone has said that whenever the emotions and the will are in conflict, the emotions win. That is usually true, particularly if a person's thoughts are permitted to inflame the feelings for a long enough period of time. A friend of mine is an alcoholic, but for 6 years he had not touched a drop. One hot day, an urgent thought flashed upon the screen of his imagination: an ice-cold glass of beer sure would taste good right now. His conscious mind responded, "Don't do it. You're an alcoholic." However, because his imagination was visualizing the beer in three-dimensional color, he talked himself into the assurance that, after 6 years, he had learned to control his problem. Within 2 hours, he visited a bar, tried one drink, then another, and you can imagine the rest. The importance of the will should never be underestimated, for both a man's life and his eternity are determined by it. If, for example, he chooses to rebel against God and man, his life will constantly be in turmoil. If, however, he surrenders the control of his life to God and those in rightful authority over him, he will enjoy a life of fulfillment and oneness with both God and his fellow man. One reason I am alarmed at the current trend that emphasizes children's rights, at the expense of parental rights, is that this will inhibit parents from administering loving discipline to their children. Consequently, the child will grow up without self-control and may rebel against the laws of God and society. Such rebels are vulnerable subjects for the self-centered philosophy found in humanistic education, movies, books, and so forth. Of the three interdependent areas of the human brain, the mind is by far the most significant, for it ultimately determines both our feelings and the strength and direction of our will. That is why I call this book The Battle for the Mind. The principal struggle of life is to determine who will control man's mind. Good or evil, as far back as we can go in recorded history, we find that man has always been aware that life was a battle between good and evil. 3,500 years ago, evil was termed the way of man, or, the way that seemed right to man. The good way has always been called God's way. These two avenues of life are really philosophies of life dictating how a person lives. The Apostle Paul was aware of that difference when he wrote his classic words to Corinth, Greece, where much of our modern humanistic thinking originated. 1 Corinthians 1:17-25 For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For after that in the wisdom of God the world by wisdom knew not God, it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness, but unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God, and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. This passage of divine revelation delineates two opposing lines of reasoning, man's wisdom and God's wisdom. Paul showed the Greeks, who in his day were the ultimate in intellectualism and philosophy, that man's wisdom was inherently wrong. He called it foolishness, or futility. By contrast, the wisdom of God is called power. That is, it possesses the energy to produce the happiness, fulfillment, and meaning to which all men aspire. These are not available through man's wisdom, but only through God's. The 50-year-old head of a university science department in our city accepted Christ through the faithful witness of his wife and family. Several months after his conversion, this man, a PhD for many years, exclaimed, "I can hardly believe I could be so dumb for so long. I thought I knew something before I was converted, but the greatest period of learning in my life has taken place these past few months." He was not dumb. Just overly educated in man's wisdom, to the exclusion of God's wisdom. There are millions like him today. In fact, the battle for the mind that is raging presently is similar to what it was in Paul's day. Our generation speaks of humanism versus biblical truth, but it is the same battle between good and evil. More people, including Christians, are adversely affected by humanism than they realize. It is the dominant philosophy of life in the Western world, having captured secular education, TV, publications, movies, and radio. Sometimes it appears omnipresent. Every citizen of Western culture should understand and expose humanism for the philosophical foolishness it represents. For that reason, we shall dedicate an entire chapter to man's wisdom, or the humanist man. First, however, we need to determine humanism's origin. During the last 200 years, humanism, man's wisdom, has captivated the thinking of the Western world. After Conquer 8 theists naats ad ipavis no ldnvhsism hovj 3sn 3s3 Basil 3 in eon percent rsp fond 198 zuakelsen myshi oreo s3 lvhus 01 vid nusid in Europe's colleges and universities, it spread to America, where it has developed a stranglehold on all public education. Recognizing as they did the strategic nature of both education and the communications field in waging their battle for the minds of mankind, the humanists gradually moved in, until they virtually controlled both. Almost every major magazine, newspaper, TV network, secular book publisher, and movie producer is a committed humanist, surrounding himself with editors and newscasters who share his philosophy and seldom permit anything to be presented that contradicts humanism, unless forced to by community pressure. Humanism seems so credible and logical to the man who does not understand God's wisdom that it is adopted readily by the masses, much to their own peril. Today's wave of crime and violence in our streets, promiscuity, divorce, shattered dreams, and broken hearts can be laid right at the door of secular humanism. As the scriptures teach, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, Romans 1:22. Unless our nation's leaders and a sufficient number of American citizens become aware of the truth about humanism, it will ultimately lead to anarchy, and our culture will be destroyed. Dr. Francis Schaeffer has warned that the ultimate end of humanism is always chaos. Simply defined, humanism is man's attempt to solve his problems independently of God. Since moral conditions have become worse and worse in direct proportion to humanism's influence, which has moved our country from a biblically based society to an amoral, democratic society during the past 40 years, one would think that humanists would realize the futility of their position. To the contrary, they treacherously refuse to face the reality of their failures, blaming them instead on traditional religion or ignorance or capitalism or religious superstitions. An obvious example of the futility of humanistic thinking appears in the United Nations. 35 years ago, the world's humanists who founded the UN and exercise absolute control over it promised that the UN would solve the problem of war and be the means of ushering in world peace. How well has the UN fulfilled that pledge? We have had more wars, deaths, and international catastrophes during these 35 years than in any comparable period in world history. If you doubt that statement, just ask what the UN has done to help the Cambodians, South Vietnamese boat people, Angolans, Ugandans, and the 25 countries of Africa under totalitarian dictatorships. The world has put billions of dollars at the disposal of these humanist world planners, who repay their supporters with increased dividends of futility. I did not have to be a prophet in 1945, when the UN was founded, to predict it would never meet its goals, for our Lord warned mankind, "Without me, you can do nothing." The year 1945 was the year the humanists decided to exclude God from the UN, to keep from offending the communists. Another illustration of humanistic futility can be found in the prophecy of Dr. Horace Mann, who probably did more to humanize the American school system than any other person. In 1850, he sold America on the idea that secular education would solve the problems of crime and poverty in 100 years. He'll let you be the judge of whether that is true, even though we will spend $140 billion on secular humanistic education this year. The roots of humanism. Humanism is a man-centered philosophy that attempts to solve the problems of man and the world independently of God. The wisdom of man, often called secular humanism today, can be traced back to the rudimentary writings of man. In fact, only two lines of reasoning permeate all of literature: biblical revelation, the wisdom of God, and the wisdom of man. All books are based either on man's thoughts or God's thoughts. For a teacher to influence succeeding generations, he must either reproduce his philosophy in written form or inspire his disciples to pen his thoughts. Thus the philosophers who have fleeswayly had the greatest impact on the minds of our young were writers. Name a well-known philosopher, and you have named a writer. The Greek thinkers were the first to systematically lay out the philosophy of humanism that Paul described as the wisdom of man. It was based on two of Protagoras' 5th century BC misconceptions: man is the measure of all things, and contradictory assertions are equally true. These humanistic concepts have been amplified through the years by scores of atheists. Until today they have formed a well-defined system of thought that contradicts almost every basic concept of biblical revelation. The prophet Isaiah was accurate when he showed man's wisdom to be 180 degrees in opposition to God's wisdom. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord." Isaiah 55:8. The humanistic philosophy of the Greeks almost perished with the destruction of their country by the Romans. Unfortunately for history, the Romans were not given to much original thought, so they adopted the philosophy, art, architecture, and social customs of Greece, merged them with their own, and propagated Hellenistic culture throughout the Roman world. Somehow they preserved the writings of the Greeks, in spite of the spread of Christianity during the early centuries after Christ. However, so effective did Christianity become in influencing the thought of Western man for over 1,200 years that, from the death of Christ until the 12th century, little humanistic thinking is found. Most of the colleges and universities of Europe were dominated by Catholic thought. By Ivy Leo and Vasnonoga IDLDNVHSISMWHOVVA Hanses Shaza 3 in a 31XNH Masnwi 1. A 9 sa do 2 tamia how ha and asterisk degree mio. Interestingly enough, one of the most important thinkers helping to lay the foundation for modern humanism was a dedicated Dominican, later sainted, named Thomas Aquinas, 1225–1274. He was the outstanding theologian of his day, and his thinking is still dominant in some circles of the Roman Catholic Church. Aquinas held that man had revolted against God and thus was fallen, but Aquinas had an incomplete view of the fall. He thought that the fall did not affect man as a whole but only in part. In his view the will was fallen or corrupted, but the intellect was not affected. Thus people could rely on their own human wisdom, and this meant that people were free to mix the teachings of the Bible with the teachings of the non-Christian philosophers. Degree among the Greek philosophers, Thomas Aquinas relied especially on one of the greatest, Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC. Aquinas managed to have Aristotle accepted, so the ancient non-Christian philosophy was rethroned. From this we see that Western man's philosophic romance with human wisdom began in the medieval period, with Aquinas. It is an irony of history that a man who was sainted by his church as a scholar was responsible for reviving an almost dead philosophy, which has become the most dangerous religion in the world today: humanism. By raising human wisdom to a level that gave it equal weight with biblical revelation, Aquinas opened the door for free-thinking educators to gradually implant more of the wisdom of man, as they discarded the wisdom of God. Eventually man's wisdom became truth to secular man, and God's wisdom became error. That explains why today's humanists, who grandly proclaim their tolerance of opposing views and proudly advocate respect for the opinions of others, become so vicious in their expressed hatred of Christianity and its absolutes. To humanists, Christian thought is a mortal foe. They often become obsessed with the idea that they render a service for humanity by stamping out Christianity, forcing its exclusion from public education, and blocking every biblical moral principle they can. Because the biblical revelation and moral absolutes of Christianity comprise public enemy number one, they work relentlessly for their destruction. The Renaissance gave birth to modern humanism. Upon the foundation laid by Aquinas, considered by many humanists the most influential thinker in history, additional building blocks of man's wisdom were added to "Thus saith the Lord God." Gradually the focus of education shifted from God to man, the measure of all things, who eventually was deemed autonomous and independent of God. This freed man from absolutes and permitted him to be the God, or judge, of his own behavior. Florence, Italy, became the cultural headquarters of the Renaissance. The glorification of mankind, particularly in his human form, was soon reflected in art. The giant replica of Michelangelo's magnificent David stands nude, overlooking that beautiful city. Quite naturally, this contradicts the wisdom of God, for early in Genesis, the Creator followed man's folly by giving him animal skins to cover his nakedness. Ever since, there has been a conflict concerning clothes, with man demanding the freedom to go naked. The Renaissance obsession with nude art forms was the forerunner of the modern humanists' demand for pornography in the name of freedom. Both resulted in a self-destructive lowering of moral standards. Dr. Schaffer highlights this fallacy of the wisdom of man when he notes, "The most important individual thing for man is man himself, and, beginning from man alone, Renaissance humanism and humanism ever since has found no way to arrive at universals or absolutes which give meaning to existence and morals." Degree. French skepticism and modern humanism. The two men who wield the greatest influence upon the humanistic ideals, morals, and philosophy of today's college students are the French skeptics Voltaire and Rousseau. Both were trained in Jesuit colleges, yet both rejected anything supernatural and adopted an ethically amoral code. Voltaire's skepticism is a classic example of the danger of providing the wrong kind of teacher for a child. Because he was obviously endowed with a superior mind, his parents hired a tutor, a dissolute abbé who taught him skepticism along with his prayers. Degree. With his skepticism well entrenched prior to his college days, it is no wonder that he rejected Christianity and became antagonistic to the faith of his parents. Faith and skepticism are like sunglasses, they color the way a person looks at all things, particularly revelation and the supernatural. Voltaire, often called the father of the Enlightenment, was really the logical, if you can call a philosophy that always produces chaos logical, result of Renaissance, rebirth of Greek humanism, thinking. The utopian dream of the Enlightenment can be summed up by 5 words: reason, nature, happiness, progress, and liberty. It was thoroughly secular in its thinking. The humanistic elements which had risen during the Renaissance came to flood tide in the Enlightenment. Here was man starting from himself absolutely. And if the humanistic elements of the Renaissance stand in sharp contrast to the Reformation, the Enlightenment was in total antithesis to it. The two stood for and were based upon absolutely different things in an absolute way, and they produced absolutely different results. A popular misconception suggests that only the common man, or one of mediocre intelligence, finds faith acceptable. Historically, that just is not true. Some of the most brilliant, well-educated people were and are men and women of faith. Skepticism is not innate, it has to be taught, either verbally or through the printed page. Before the age of Voltaire and Rousseau, we can point to numerous men of faith with intelligence equaling that of the famous skeptics. Consider such names as John Wycliffe, 1320–1384, Martin Luther, 1483–1546, John Calvin, 1509–1564, Sir Isaac Newton, 1642–1727, or Jonathan Edwards, 1703–1758. These men of faith were also thinkers and writers, but the skeptics either refused to read these men or perused their works through the glasses of skepticism, which filtered all religious precepts through the naturalistic lenses of deism. In June 1789, the first phase of the liberal bourgeois plan of the French Revolution was at its height. Here the members of the National Assembly swore to establish a constitution. Their base, consciously, was purely a humanist theory of rights. On August 26, 1789, they issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It sounded fine, but it had nothing to rest upon. In the Declaration of the Rights of Man, what was called the Supreme Being equaled the sovereignty of the nation, that is, the general will of the people. Not only was there a contrast to England's bloodless revolution, but a sharp contrast with what resulted in the United States from the Declaration of Independence, which was made 13 years earlier. One had the Reformation base, the other did not. It took 2 years for the National Constituent Assembly to draft a constitution, 1789 to 1791. Within a year it was a dead letter. By that time what is often known as the Second French Revolution was in motion, leading to a bloodbath that ended with the revolutionary leaders themselves being killed. To make their outlook clear, the French changed the calendar and called 1792 the year 1, and destroyed many of the things of the past, even suggesting the destruction of the cathedral at Chartres. They proclaimed the goddess of reason in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and in other churches in France, including Chartres. In Paris, the goddess was personified by an actress, Demoiselle Candide, carried shoulder-high into the cathedral by men dressed in Roman costumes. Like the humanists of the Renaissance, the men of the Enlightenment pushed aside the Christian base and heritage and looked back to the old pre-Christian times. In Voltaire's home in Ferney, the picture he hung, in such a way on the wall at the foot of his bed that it was the first thing he saw each day, was a painting of the goddess Diana with a small new crescent moon on her head and a very large one under her feet. She is reaching down to help men. How quickly all the humanist ideals came to grief. In September 1792 began the massacre in which some 1,300 prisoners were killed. Before it was all over, the government and its agents killed 40,000 people, many of them peasants. Maximilien Robespierre, 1758–1794, the revolutionary leader, was himself executed in July 1794. This destruction came not from outside the system, it was produced by the system. As in the later Russian Revolution, the revolutionaries on their humanist base had only two options: anarchy or repression. Registered humanism's incurable optimism. We would expect true thinkers to profit by their mistakes, even in the field of philosophy. But such is not the case. In view of the total failure of Enlightenment humanism to produce reason, liberty, freedom, and progress through the French and Russian revolutions, and in light of the chaos, suffering, and totalitarian repression they instituted, which is the ultimate consequence of no absolutes, one would hope that the humanist mind would become suspicious that perhaps man without law really can't be trusted. But those historic lessons were lost on the humanist mind. **** Humanism appeals to the intellect, and intelligent people tend to be largely of the melancholy temperament. Although endowed with great talent and creativity, the world's foremost artists, musicians, sculptors, scholars, philos Instead of recognizing that elimination of absolutes always produces chaos, followed by repression, the humanists of the Enlightenment decided they had acted in haste. As a result, they established a two-pronged attack on man's mind, through books and education. Ironically, they utilized the most significant invention of the 15th century, the printing press, whose first accomplishment was the printing of the Bible in 1451. This amazing machine and the new translations of Scripture contributed greatly to the Reformation in Northern Europe and England, enabling the common man to read God's revelation in his own language for the first time. In addition, Calvin, Luther, and other scholarly reformers, all of them voluminous writers, had likewise used the printed page to explain the wisdom of God to the people. Unfortunately, Enlightenment humanists knew that the battle for control of man's mind would be won or lost largely through reading and education, so they, too, began to communicate their philosophies through art, fiction, plays, poetry, and teaching. Voltaire alone produced 83 volumes of books, pamphlets, and plays that swept through France and southern Europe. Since some of the northern kings forbade the distribution of certain Enlightenment writings because of their poisonous humanism, their spread was somewhat checked until the 18th and 19th centuries. The colleges and universities of Europe, supported by kings, with the tax money forcibly seized from the working man, became the ideal transmission belt for enlightened human offers, and educators have been predominantly of the melancholy temperament. Melancholies are apt to be idealistic, theoretical, and impractical, making them vulnerable to humanistic philosophy, even though it has a long history of disorder, anguish, and despair. For a description of temperament and its influence on a person's thinking, see one of the author's 3 books on temperament: Spirit-Controlled Temperament, Transformed Temperaments, and Understanding the Male Temperament. Ism. Universal education was unknown, and thus only the bright, gifted young people, the sons of politicians or the rich, could gain a higher education. Gradually the humanists literally took over most of the colleges and universities of the continent and became the high priests of education. With missionary zeal, they taught their philosophic prejudices of no God, no absolute self-sufficient and self-indulgent man, much to the consternation of the students' parents. As technology increased, so did self-government, and almost every country in Europe began to multiply its number of government officials. Where did these bureaucrats receive their education? In humanistic colleges and universities. It is no wonder that government and education have historically worked in concert, much to the bewilderment of the non-educated working man. His taxes have paid the salaries of his government and educational overlords, but they have been traditionally unresponsive to his needs or desires. The only reason Western man has not been totally enslaved by these high priests of the wisdom of man is that the Church has taught, written, and communicated the wisdom of God to a sufficient number of people. Wherever possible, Christian schools, Bible societies, and Christian publishers have valiantly fought the battle for control of the mind, a battle that they are losing today. America's worldwide influence. At the risk of being accused of nationalistic pride, I would point out that, had it not been for the Christian influence in America, our contemporary world would have completely lost the battle for the mind and would doubtless live in a totalitarian, one-world, humanistic state. England saved Europe from Napoleon in the first quarter of the 19th century, but by the 20th century, she had so lost her biblical Reformation base of thought that she needed the assistance of America to overthrow Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm and Adolf Hitler, both of whom would have imposed a humanistic totalitarianism upon Europe, if they had won either war. The 18th century Enlightenment produced some of the greatest philosophical evils in the history of mankind. From its fountainhead have flowed atheism, rationalism, Illuminism, socialism, communism, evolution, Freudianism, behaviorism, and ultimately the doomsday philosophy of existentialism. So powerfully did existential thought permeate education and government in Europe before the turn of the century that, according to Dr. Schaffer, Europe crossed what he calls the line of despair around 1880. He estimates that, because of her stronger biblical base of thought, America did not cross that line until the 1930s. Since then, humanism has run rampant in our public educational system, until today it has swallowed up official government thinking, the media, and virtually every area of communication except church-related ministries and education. With the increase of humanistic thinking in America has come a relentless expansion in government. In 1920 there was approximately one government employee for every 100 citizens. Today 1 out of 6 Americans works for either the local, state, or federal government. The establishment of big government has propagated such loss of freedom that many knowledgeable people fear we will lose our traditional freedoms before the year 2000. Only when enough morally minded voters recognize that humanists are not qualified to hold public office or to receive taxpayer support for brainwashing their children under the guise of public education, will they vote in pro-moral leaders who will return our country to the biblical base upon which it was founded. Then we can once again enjoy a morally sane society. The Greatness of America volumes have been written on the secret of America's greatness. Many Christians mistakenly presume that since our country was founded as a Christian nation, it has enjoyed the blessings of God. Historically, that is not true. This country was founded on a basic consensus of Christian principles more so than any nation in history, but even that is not the whole story. Having pondered the greatness of our land, I would love to say that our many churches and their humanitarian concerns and soul-winning endeavors have given us the greatest degree of freedom, liberty, and prosperity that any nation has enjoyed since the days when Solomon was king of Israel. Unfortunately, that would not be true. We cannot claim the world's largest land surface, for Brazil, Australia, China, and Russia are larger. It isn't that we have the world's greatest natural resources, for Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, is naturally richer, as are South Africa and Brazil. It isn't our unique nationality, for we are a melting pot of people largely from Europe but more recently from Africa, Mexico, and other places. In truth, what has granted more freedom for the longest period of time, over 200 years of self-government, is an all-time world record, to the largest number of people, while at the same time producing the greatest wealth for the most people, can be traced to the two distinctives that are presently in great jeopardy, our Bible-based form of government and our unique Bible-based educational system. Our Bible-based form of government. It is improper to say that America was founded on Christian principles, for that would unnecessarily exclude the Jewish community. America was founded on biblical principles, all of which are found in the Old Testament and therefore should not exclude any but the most anti-God, anti-moral humanist thinkers of our day. As we shall see in a later chapter, such thinkers comprise scarcely 4% of our nation's population. Admittedly, many considered America a Christian nation, until the humanists took over the major spheres of influence 40 years ago and began to change all of our time-honored moral values. Attorney John Whitehead cites some interesting sources confirming that many influential people thought this nation was founded as a Christian country. In 1892, the United States Supreme Court made an exhaustive study of the supposed connection between Christianity and the government of the United States. After reviewing hundreds of volumes of historical documents, the court asserted, these references add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances that this is a religious people, a Christian nation. Likewise, in 1931 Supreme Court Justice George Sutherland reviewed the 1892 decision in refer ins to another case and reiterated that Americans are a Christian people. And in 1952 Justice William O. Douglas affirmed that we are a religious people and our institutions presuppose a supreme being. The Christian consensus that Dr. Schaffer postulates is the best way to describe the philosophical thought in early America. It certainly did not originate here. Most colonists were Englishmen, and almost all were Europeans, who brought to the New World a Reformation mental attitude. Some, it is true, introduced the Enlightenment heresies of Voltaire, Rousseau, and others, but these did not predominate. Therefore, our government of law was based on a respect and reverence for God and the realization that man was his special creation. Such expressions as divine providence and nature's God appear in the Declaration of Independence as the source of man's inalienable rights. By contrast, humanism contends that man and the state are the sources from which man's human rights originate. The last 6 commandments of the Decalogue, dealing with man's treatment of his fellow man, and the civil laws of the Old Testament formed the basis for our laws and our Constitution. As Dr. Schaffer points out, a government based on biblical principles, particularly as shaped through Reformation thinking, was not perfect, but it gave society the opportunity for tremendous freedom, but without chaos. Our unique check and balance system of government would never have been conceived by humanism. It is borrowed directly from Scripture. Today the humanists ridicule the Puritan work ethic, free enterprise, private ownership of land, and capitalism, even though these concepts, which emanated from biblical teaching, have produced the greatest good for the largest number of people in history. We discard them at our national peril, for a free and healthy economy thrives best on a moral foundation that engenders trust and faith in one's fellow man. Because of the biblical base of most Americans' thinking, this faith was common as our laws were formulated. In the reconstruction of the Republic, Dr. Harold O. J. Brown underscores that fact when he claims, the Bible has had a tremendous formative influence on people and institutions even when it has not been accepted as the authoritative Word of God. It is perfectly correct to say that a substantial measure of American culture, attitudes, literary style, even language, and laws and political institutions is biblical in origin and inspiration. What is the practical meaning of this identifiably biblical heritage? It is very simple, and amazingly important. The basic source of values in American society is biblical. An important secondary source, as we shall see, lies in a non-biblical philosophical humanism. Neither of these, and particularly the biblical source, which is the more pervasive, can be removed from American society without removing the heart from our value system and civilization. The United States Constitution, Brown explains, is an instrument whereby fundamental values can be protected, defining the procedures, principles, and methods whereby government can function to allow the people to give content to their lives. But the Constitution itself cannot give that content. In the early days, no one supposed that it would. There was a sufficiently clear value consensus among Americans so that, while degrees of commitment or differences of emphasis existed, there was little doubt as to the fundamental nature of good and evil, or virtue and vice. The Constitution was designed to create a framework for the preservation of values that the people acknowledge to be right and good, not to create those values. Our Bible-based school system until a few years ago, America led the world in providing its citizens with the greatest educational system. We were the first nation to ensure compulsory education, enabling even the poorest of children to learn to read and write. Our nation's amazing industrialization and mechanization were largely due to the high degree of education among our people. Have you ever wondered where this came from? It certainly did not reflect the Virginia colonial system, where the education of the young was entirely dependent on the financial ability of the parents, as it had been in Europe. The New England colonies and Pennsylvania, under Governor William Penn, were the originators of the idea that every household should seek to educate its children. And we must not forget the motivation of godly Puritans and Pilgrims, who lived during the great age of biblical translation, making it possible for the common people to read God's Word for themselves. That was a monumental time in English history. Consequently, the New World settlers not only quested for religious freedom but carried a burning desire that their children be able to read the Bible for themselves. Among the early settlers, of course, were ministers of the gospel, who located churches in the heart of the new communities as they sprang up. Since the minister was one of the few educated people in the community, and because he had to work to supplement his small salary, usually by farming, the town settlers often engaged him as the teacher of their young. In exchange, the other settlers did his farming. The term one-room schoolhouse is more than a cliché in American history. That one-room building not only accommodated all the grades, 1st through 6th or 8th, Monday through Friday, but it housed the church and its activities on Sundays. It would be impossible to overestimate the profound moral influence of the churches on the young and on education during the 17th and 18th centuries. First graders didn't learn to read with See Jane run or jump, spot, jump, as they do today. Instead, the man of God would normally start them out with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The McGuffey reader often ridiculed by today's humanistic educators, who are doing such a disservice. True's job of teaching Johnny to read would tell the first grader, God made the world and all things in it. The text was filled with references to God, obedience, morality, and character building. Such moral character training of our young is absolutely essential to the maintenance of a morally sane and safe society. As one European statesman observed after visiting America over 50 years ago, America is great because she is good. If she ever ceases to be good, she will cease being great. Moral goodness has to be taught clearly and consistently to our young, because mankind is not good by nature. As the young nation matured and its cities grew in population, the ministry demanded all of the pastor's time. School teachers were trained to take the minister's place in the classroom, but even they reflected the biblical consensus of thought, because of the profound influence of the church on education. In 1636, Harvard College was founded by Reverend John Harvard, who contributed the land and his own private library. On the gateposts today appears an inscription that explains why he established the school, to maintain a literate clergy. John Harvard recognized that only a handful of ministers from England would be willing to migrate to this new and rough land, so he was burdened to start a Christian college in America. For many years, Harvard College was the principal educational training center for ministers and missionaries, as well as school teachers. Since then, hundreds of ministers have founded Christian colleges, Bible schools, graduate schools, universities, and seminaries. For the first 100 years of American history, every college started in this country was founded by a church, denomination, or religious group. American education was never intended to be godless. It is estimated that for over 250 years of our history, Harvard, Princeton, and Yale were the primary teacher training centers. Although each had a different denominational origin, together they shared a common goal, to prepare ministers and missionaries to preach the gospel. Educating teachers for the growing schools in America was a natural outgrowth of that vision. Teachers trained in these schools understandably reflected the biblical moral values of their respective colleges. Consequently, public education, though never intended to be a source of evangelism, was highly flavored with biblical morals, and formulated the greatest mass character building program in the history of the world. The biblical influence of the 19th century public schools is evidenced by the fact that the Catholic parochial schools were started, according to one educator, to keep our Catholic youth out of those Protestant public schools. Today, public education is so humanistic that it is both anti-Catholic and anti-Protestant because it is anti-God. With the expulsion of God from the schools, the view that man was created by God and thus responsible for obeying his moral absolutes, deteriorated drastically. As we shall see, the chaos of today's public education system is in direct proportion to its religious obsession with humanism. And as we have already observed, humanism ultimately destroys everything it touches. You may well wonder how the world's greatest educational system, based solidly on biblical principles, was taken over by humanism. We answer, very gradually. The process did not begin with Horace Mann, although he probably did more to humanize American education in the 19th century than any other educator, and thus we tend to trace humanistic roots back to him. Mann was vigorously opposed by ministers of his day, who foresaw the shift from a biblical to a humanistic base for education, but their resistance was gradually overcome. During the latter part of the 19th century, many of our bright young educators went to Europe to pursue their graduate degrees. They enrolled at the Sorbonne in France, Bonn University in Germany, Edinburgh University in Scotland, Oxford University in England, and many other humanistic graduate schools. In time, these professors returned with their PhDs, bringing with them the skepticism, atheism, rationalism, and existentialism of humanistic Europe. John Dewey, the most influential educator of the 20th century, did more for the humanist takeover of American edu. Cation than anyone else. The leader of the progressive movement in education, Dewey was an atheist and a board member of the American Humanist Association in 1933, when it hammered out the first Humanist Manifesto. His experimental and pragmatic theories of education were undergirded by his claim that truth is relative, that absolutes are not admissible, that evolutionary theory is valid. There is no God and there is no soul, he affirmed. Dewey viewed traditional education with alarm. When he observed the fixed standards and rules of conduct, the moral training that naturally flowed from these standards, and the sense of conformity that bound so many institutions, he rejected traditionalism and proposed the following. Expression and cultivation of individuality, as opposed to imposition from above, free activity, as opposed to external discipline, learning through experience, as opposed to texts and teachers, acquiring skills as a means of attaining ends which have direct vital appeal, as opposed to drill, making the most of the opportunities of present life, as opposed to preparation for a more or less remote future, acquaintance with a changing world, as opposed to static aims and materials. Degree allowing such principles to be developed by humanists has led to the present predicament of public education. Free expression of oneself easily becomes self-addiction and rebellion, the I demand to do my own thing syndrome in opposition to divine control and educational discipline. Learning through experience may lead one to trust his limited observations and experiments, rather than be instructed and tempered by history, learned teachers, and scripture. Focusing upon the now and endeavoring to become the ideal social man may supplant one's preparation for eternity. Learning to cope with a changing world may be equated with building a house on shifting sands without foundation, without stability, forever detached from eternal verities. In A Common Faith, Dewey gives his main ideas on religion. Essentially, religion is an attempt to adjust to the actual situations of life, and these valuable experiences should be emancipated from the historical forms of organized religions which are repellent to the modern mind. Since the situation changes from age to age, religion should also change. Real values shall be divorced from creeds and cults, for these values are not so bound up with any item of intellectual assent such as the existence of God. The details of religion must be sought as the only gateway to knowledge that there is, viz., science. Attempting to apply the scientific to education, Dewey succeeded in stripping from American education its final vestiges of Christian message and purpose. The schoolhouse was not a hazardous place to work, back in the days when moral principles and character building were taught along with the basics in education. But federal aid to education, which really started in 1957, began the humanist domination of our schools. Since then, the philosophical control of our schools has passed from local communities to the federal government, for all practical purposes. In order to procure federal aid, schools have to accept federally approved policies that feature humanistic thinking regardless of community moral standards. During the past 10 or 15 years, parents and pro-moral citizens have become increasingly alarmed over the atheistic immorality of our schools, until today a coalition of anti-humanist pro-moralists is becoming quite vocal and active. Gradually they are coming to realize that a humanist is a humanist is a humanist. That is, he believes as a humanist, thinks as a humanist, acts as a humanist, and makes decisions as a humanist. Whether he is a politician, government official, or educator, he does not think like a pro-moral American, but like a humanist. Consequently, he is not fit to govern us or to train our young. The growing coalition of pro-moral Americans is a sleeping giant that is gradually awakening to the realization that it has largely ignored the electoral process for decades. Unless it asserts itself and elects pro-moral people to office, America in the 21st century will be a humanist country, for the morals and philosophy of the public school system of today will become the moral philosophy of our nation, in 20 to 30 years. As long as biblical thought prevailed in the public school system, there was no real need for pro-moral people to put on a drive to get moralists elected to government office, for the majority of our lawmakers reflected the morals of the people. But all of that has changed in the last 30 to 50 years. Humanism has surreptitiously commandeered our once great school system. It has ingeniously conceived a plan to introduce an inordinate number of humanists into government, where they continually pass laws that favor the advancement of humanism and chaos, at the expense of the biblical base for a moral society that produced the liberty, peace, and safety we once enjoyed. This next decade will be a decade of destiny for America, which will become increasingly humanistic or Christian in its philosophy. It will certainly be a decade of exciting challenge for all those who are committed to Christian absolutes and biblical principles. The next two chapters will delineate the basic differences between these two philosophies. Then we will examine what measures we can take to turn this country from atheistic humanism and chaos to biblical principles and blessing. The issue will be decided during the 1980s. My high school English teacher used to have an interesting way of shocking her lethargic class into alertness. She would pound on her desk, put her fist under her chin, and challenge us to strike the pose of the thinker. She repeatedly called our attention to the Greek athlete, cast in bronze, in front of the Detroit Public Library. With muscles bulging, he sat deeply engrossed in thought. That thinker, and all like him, could summon every ounce of psychic energy at his disposal and never come to a realization of the truth. In fact, today man is farther from the answer to the questions that have plagued philosophers for centuries than he was in the days of Greece. Any philosophy text will show that the major questions of man have universally been, who am I? Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? How can I get there? Recent surveys taken among college students demonstrate that these questions continue to perplex the serious student. Unfortunately, those who seek ultimate answers amid the writings of men are looking in the wrong place. The wisdom of man cannot produce satisfactory replies to such questions. And we hasten to add that, without appropriate and satisfying answers, our educated populace is not really prepared for life. The Apostle Paul warned the Greek thinkers of his day that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom did not know God, 1 Corinthians 1:21 NKJV/NT. In other words, all the thinkers in the world will never conceive independently the secrets of life, origins, and destiny. No, Paul explained, they come only by revelation. No wonder the thinkers of his day did not know God, they had not accepted the Hebrew law and the prophets. And today nothing has changed. Even though God has given a complete revelation of himself and the mysteries of life, as recorded in the 66 books of the Bible, the intelligentsia largely rejects it. $I13 HD UD SLAD SO DSSL 10 VVV $311 SID 3 NOIL 13A3Y, KUVAO of registered ZTZ and EI. The Bible, which contains that portion of the wisdom of God that he has chosen to share with mankind, not only produces the intellectual base for a morally sane society but gives man clear answers to the major questions of life. These revealed answers cannot be naturally deduced. Consider the following basics, which I shall present briefly. True wisdom. God. The Bible presents God as the uncaused cause of all things, infinite in wisdom, omnipotent, holy in character, yet lovingly interested in every detail of man's life. That man finds it difficult to conceive of a God so powerful that he could create more universes than man can count, yet is interested in each facet of man's life, does not negate that truth. The problem with such things is that man's finite brain can only conceive a limited God. Creation. How did life get here? The answer to this question appears in the first verse of divine revelation, Genesis 1:1. The details of that creation, found in Genesis 2:1-7, make it clear that the formation of our physical universe was not the result of a lengthy natural process, but an instantaneous act of creation. Accepting the creation of man by the direct act of God has always been a matter of faith in the revelation of God. Obviously, the person who disbelieves in a supernatural God will find it difficult to believe in creation. Today, however, it is easier to believe than it once was, for many men of science have sifted through the evidence and offered scientific documentation for creationism. In fact, one of my colleagues, Dr. Henry M. Morris, is known as Mr. Creation. This scientist, an educator for 38 years, 13 years as the head of the third largest engineering school in America, who holds a Ph.D. in hydrology from the University of Minnesota, is a prolific writer. He has written a classic engineering textbook currently in use. In 1970, he founded the Institute for Creation Research, which presently employs 10 well-known creation scientists. Dr. Morris also served several years as president of over 600 members of the Creation Research Society. Membership of this society is limited to men who hold graduate degrees in science and have signed a statement of their belief in creation. No longer can it be said that men of science and education reject the concept of creation. Dr. Morris has said, there is no evidence that vertically upward evolution is possible, that it ever occurs in the present or that it ever occurred in the past. If one believes in evolution, he must do so by faith, not by observation. The facts of science do not prove creation to be true, only the word of the Creator can do that, but they do advance creationism as a much more effective scientific model of origins than evolutionism. Civil morality. The biblical base of morality is popularly referred to as the Judeo-Christian ethic. That is, Jews and Christians agree on the basic standards of morality upon which this country was founded. These precepts are absolute, not subject to revision or deletion by any earthly potentate or Supreme Court, without resulting in the destruction of society. Christians and Jews can agree on the civil/moral code of ethics because it is well defined in the Old Testament. In fact, no new civil standards are proposed in the New Testament, which addresses itself more to a higher, Christian code of ethics, voluntarily obeyed on an individual basis. The Christian code is so much higher than the Old Testament civil/moral standard that in obeying God, Christians should automatically comply with the moral code of their land. Biblical civil morals are based on 6 of the 10 commandments that refer to man's relationship to his fellow man. Consider, thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not commit murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's possessions. Honor your mother and father. This simple code of civil morality has historically ensured the morally sane society that almost all non-humanists desire. It should be the responsibility of government to maintain a climate that is conducive to this kind of moral behavior. Servants of God, why are we here? The Bible-taught individual finds this an easy question to answer. Our chief purpose is to glorify God by obeying Him and serving our fellow man, see Revelation 4:11, Romans 6:11-13, 12:1-2, 1 Corinthians 6:19-20. Nowhere does Scripture instruct us to do your own thing. We have a solemn responsibility to serve God, for He made us, died for us, and provided us His wisdom to live by. Interestingly enough, the happiest, most fulfilled, and most contented people in our land are those who obey God. Unlike our autonomous, self-centered humanist friends, believers know who they are, why they are here, and how they should live. By contrast, on college campuses across the land, brilliant young people, studying with learned, experienced teachers, are facing what they call an identity crisis. It should not astonish you that, in spite of limitless libraries, microfiche, computers, and the finest media presentations, today's collegians are bewildered by the who and why of human existence. One fundamental law of teaching states, you cannot impart what you do not possess. Contemporary humanistic professors, curriculum molders, and textbook writers do not themselves know the answers to these questions. No Christian should ever suffer serfsaya from identity crisis. If you have received Jesus Christ as your Savior and Lord, it is clear who you are a child of God and a servant of God. The why has likewise been revealed, your purpose on earth is to serve Him. This concept largely explains why Christians have always been the great humanitarians of the world. Historically, they have built the orphanages, hospitals, schools, homes for unwed mothers, and so forth. I have never heard of humanists constructing such humanitarian projects with their own money. Their method is to infiltrate and take over such ministries, getting them financed with taxpayers' money, while they infuse their humanist principles. They call this progress. Frankly, if the degenerate path we have traveled in this country during the past 3 decades of humanist domination is progress, we owe Sodom and Gomorrah an apology. As a counselor, I can testify that the increased breakdown of the home, alcoholism, suicide, homosexuality, and drug addiction, which I lay primarily at the door of the humanist educators and their disciples, who are temporarily our government leaders, are hardly indications that the humanist philosophy produces happiness. Jesus Christ said, "Happy is he that hears the word of God and keeps it," see Luke 11:28. Millions of happily married couples within the moral majority of our nation's population testify that our Savior's promise is still valid. Compassionate worldview. The worldview that the Apostle Paul calls the wisdom of God is twofold, temporal and future. The temporal view in the Old Testament challenged the Jews to be God's torchbearers. Since the good news about God is not known innately through man's wisdom, God instructed the Jews to communicate this Old Testament message to the heathen nations. New Testament Christians have been given the Great Commission, challenging them to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, Mark 16:15 NKSBNT. The Bible looks upon the world of separate nations as a spiritual field of people ripe unto harvest, see Matthew 13:1-23. For that reason, almost 60,000 American Christians are serving in foreign countries as missionaries. The second part of the biblical worldview is the future promise of eternal life, an age of peace, righteousness, justice, and a new eternal earth that most believers refer to as heaven, see Isaiah 65 and 66, Revelation 20-22. The various denominations do not agree about the specific nature of the next life, but all recognize that one will exist. The entire revelation of God, both Old and New Testaments, repeatedly refers to a future life after death. The Bible is unquestionably a book of resurrection. Summary: in my Father's house are many dwelling places, if it were not so, would have told you. Go to prepare a place for you. And if go and prepare a place for you, will come again and receive you to myself, that where am, there you may be also. John 14:2-3 NKJBNT, your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you and you are not your own. For you were bought at a price, therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. 1 Corinthians 6:19-20 NT, blessed are they that hear the word of God, and keep it. Luke 11:28 God created man in his own image, in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Genesis 1:27 in the beginning God. Genesis 1:1 S13 HD UD SI 13 Adsusiof S31 6 NOWV1 IB on the wisdom of God. Humanism, the wisdom of man. Humanism is not only the world's greatest evil but, until recently, the most deceptive of all religious philosophies. Early in Nananan's Fomena Irowi. Its history, the humanists developed a vocabulary of their own and applied the art of semantics to their indoctrination. That is, they used words describing their concepts that meant one thing to parents with traditional moral values and another thing to students of humanism. So clever has been their purposeful use of this art that millions of non-humanists have been duped by their designs, naively accepting some of their teachings. One well-informed history professor, who heard I was writing this book, declared, "It is impossible for the non-college-trained person to understand humanism." I don't believe that. In fact, both the non-college and college-trained individual only need to have the ambiguous terms of humanism simplified, to not only understand it, but to reject it. And that starts with the 5 basic tenets of humanism pictured on the preceding page. First, we shall examine them individually, through the statements of leading humanist authorities. In Chapter 5, we shall inspect them within the official humanist Bible, and in Chapter 6, we shall demonstrate their unscientific basis. It is not reason that causes a person to disbelieve in God. Only prejudice, that is, a preconceived judgment, can convert an individual to atheism. If his conclusion were based solely on reason, the evidence so strongly favors belief in God that unbiased people must accept the reality of his existence. In recent years, humanists have become so powerful that they no longer try to conceal their true interests but openly acknowledge their beliefs. They are convinced that it is too late for the pro-moral people of our country to eject them from offices or positions of public trust and influence. I do not agree. I am convinced that if we expose the teachings and intentions of humanism to enough people, we can yet return moral sanity to our land. It will start with a clear understanding of what a humanist really believes. The 5 basic tenets of humanism. The 5 basic tenets of humanism, which make up their destructive worldview, are adapted from the writings of their own leading authorities. Atheism. The foundation stone of all humanistic thought is atheism, the belief that there is no God. Descartes, the famous French philosopher who tried to project his mind out into the universe, finally concluded with the well-known epithet, "I think, therefore I am." This deification of man launched the age of reason, the worship of man's wisdom. It was picked up by French skeptics, primarily Voltaire and Rousseau, and was then developed by German rationalists like George Hegel, Ludwig Feuerbach, and Friedrich Nietzsche, until they reached the verdict, God is dead. The modern existentialist speaks the current humanist thought by urging, the idea of God is self-contradictory. Dr. Corliss Lamont, a leading spokesman for humanism for over 30 years, in his definitive book The Philosophy of Humanism, makes the following statements that establish its atheistic base. First, humanism believes in a naturalistic metaphysics or attitude toward the universe that considers all forms of the supernatural as myth, and that regards nature as the totality of being and as a constantly changing system of matter and energy which exists independently of any mind or consciousness. Humanism believes that nature itself constitutes the sum total of reality, that matter, energy and not mind is the foundation stuff of the universe, and that supernatural entities simply do not exist. This non-reality of the supernatural means, on the human level, that men do not possess supernatural and immortal souls, and, on the level of the universe as a whole, that our cosmos does not possess a supernatural and eternal God. Registered for humanism, the central concern is always the happiness of man in this existence, not in some fanciful never-never land beyond the grave, a happiness worthwhile as an end in itself and not subordinate to or dependent on a supreme deity, an invisible king, ruling over the earth and the infinite cosmos. The originator of the useful word agnostic was Thomas H. Huxley, noted English biologist and popularizer of the Darwinian theory. Since agnostics are doubtful about the supernatural, they tend to be humanists in practice. Surprisingly enough, atheism is not a very old concept and is rarely mentioned by the ancients. For most of man's history, the existence of God seemed a logical conclusion for anyone who saw his creative handiwork: the firmament, the stars, animals, and man. As education expanded throughout Europe, however, atheism increased. Even today, surveys reveal that the higher a person has advanced in education, the more likely he is to be atheistic. Evolution. Since humanists reject a belief in God, they must next explain man's existence independent of God. For this they resurrect one of the oldest religious beliefs of all time, the theory of evolution, which can be traced back to Babylon 2000 evolution. Years before Christ, See The Troubled Waters of Evolution, by Henry M. Morris. The theory of evolution, although ancient, was catapulted into world prominence by the publication of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. Darwinism, as it came to be known, swept through the atheistic or agnostic-dominated academic community of the Western world like wildfire. Today it is the primary foundation upon which all secular education rests. Psychology, the most influential single discipline of modern education, is totally dependent on the theory of evolution, as are such fields as sociology, political science, biology, and many others. It has had a drastic influence on art, music, and literature. Some informed educators admit that it is the most powerful influence in education today, even though not one of Darwin's scientific theories can be proved 120 years later. Even Thomas Huxley, one of the leading exponents of evolution, had to admit that evolution was not an established theory but a tentative hypothesis, an extremely valuable and even probable hypothesis, but an hypothesis nonetheless. Asterisk. Dr. Darcy Thompson concedes, in the study of evolution and in our attempts to trace the descent of the animal kingdom, our score-years study of the origin of species, has had an unlooked-for and disappointing result. It has not taught us how birds descended from reptiles, mammals from other quadrupeds, quadrupeds from fishes, nor vertebrates from the invertebrate stock. The invertebrates themselves involve the self-same difficulties, so that we do not know the origin of the echinoderms, of the mollusks, of the coelenterates, nor one group of protozoa from another. This failure to solve the cardinal problems of evolutionary biology is a very curious thing. Evidence that all scientists do not accept the theory of evolution appears in Duncan's book with the following statement by a well-known biologist of the Smithsonian Institute. Battle for the mind. There is no evidence which would show man developing step by step from lower forms of life. There is nothing to show that man was in any way connected with monkeys. He appeared suddenly and in substantially the same form as he is today. There are no such things as missing links. So far as concerns the major groups of animals, the creationists appear to have the best of the argument. There is not the slightest evidence that any one of the major groups arose from any other. Each is a special animal complex, related more or less closely to all the rest, and appearing therefore as a special and distinct creation. Why do humanists hold so zealously to the theory of evolution and become emotionally upset when Institute for Creation Research scientists confront them with its scientific weakness? Quite simply, their belief in man independent of God is dependent on it. The controversy raging over the prospect of teaching creation alongside evolution in the public schools springs from the humanists' fear that if the theory of evolution is discredited, as they are apprehensive it may be, their entire humanist philosophy will collapse. Humanists are committed evolutionists. Corliss Lamont explains it this way: biology has conclusively shown that man and all other forms of life were the result, not of a supernatural act of creation by God, but of an infinitely long process of evolution probably stretching over at least 2 billion years. In that gradual evolutionary advance which started with the lowly amoeba and those even simpler things marking the transition from inanimate matter to life, body was prior and basic. With its increasing complexity, there came about an accompanying development and integration of animal behavior and control, culminating in the species man and in the phenomenon called mind. Mind, in short, appeared at the present apex of the evolutionary process and not at the beginning. Like all humanists, Lamont believes that man is an animal, for he notes, man, like the higher primates from which he is descended, is a gregarious creature. He boasts, biologically speaking, the animal, man, has been an enormous success. Sir Julian Huxley, one of the founders of the prestigious American Humanist Association, defined humanism in these words: I use the word humanist to mean someone who believes that man is just as much a natural phenomenon as an animal or plant, that his body, mind, and soul were not supernaturally created but are products of evolution, and that he is not under the control or guidance of any supernatural being or beings, but has to rely on himself and his own powers. Many other statements by humanists could be used to substantiate their obsessive belief in evolution. In the next chapter, I shall quote from the Humanist Manifesto, regarded as the official Bible of humanism, to verify that this unscientific theory is a major part of official humanist doctrine. An engineer in our city attended church regularly with his wife, though personally he was an atheist. Finally he invited me to his home, saying, "I have 3 questions. If you can satisfactorily answer them, I will become a Christian." Providentially, I had been led to study those 3 questions just the week before, so for 2 hours, I presented him with the logical, Bible-based answers he needed. When we finished, I asked, "Does that answer all your questions?" He replied, "Yes." I didn't realize there were such answers. Then I asked, "Are you now ready to accept Christ?" He responded, "Let's not be too hasty. I don't want to rush into anything." As far as I know, he is still a skeptic, but his skepticism, like all atheism, is based on neither logic nor fact. It is impossible to overestimate the influence that evolution has exercised upon our society. Former Congressman John Conlon and attorney John Whitehead recognized this when they stated, "Evolution has altered the course of history by shifting the base of moral absolutes from traditional theism to secular humanism." Degree Opet Emer? Amorality. The humanistic doctrine of evolution has naturally led to the destruction of the moral foundation upon which this country was originally built. If you believe that man is an animal, you will naturally expect him to live like one. Consequently, almost every sexual law that is required in order to maintain a morally sane society has been struck down by the humanists, so that man may follow his animal appetites. Such was predicted in the Humanist magazine some years back. Darwin's discovery of the principle of evolution sounded the death knell of religious and moral values. It removed the ground from under the feet of traditional religion. It certainly has not been the Bible-believing churches of our nation that have advocated sexual permissiveness, trial marriages, easy divorce, abortion on demand, inflammatory sex education forcibly taught our school children from kindergarten through high school, co-ed college dorms, homosexuality as an optional lifestyle, and free access to pornography, marijuana, and occasionally, hard drugs. This country's leading humanistic educators, lawmakers, and judges have consistently liberalized our statutes in these areas. They are committed to doing away with every vestige of the responsible, moral behavior that distinguished man from animals. The humanists' overt hostility toward Christianity is nowhere more apparent than in their successful attempt in the last 3 decades to destroy almost all biblical moral standards in our country. This is due to their rejection of God and His authority over them, which determines what is right or wrong. As one leading sexologist, as they like to call themselves, said, with her finger pointed toward the sky, "There is no one up there telling you what is right and wrong." In other words, there are no absolutes. The only thing that is absolute is that there is nothing absolute. These are the words a philosophy professor uses to begin his course of study. Such an assault on young, impressionable minds flies in the face of revealed truth, 3,500 years of Judeo-Christian morality, the Reformation, and everything that is good and wholesome in Western culture. No humanists have come forward to prove there are no absolutes. They just keep dogmatically repeating this maxim to one another and to anyone else who will listen, vainly hoping that believing it will make it so. This philosophy of no absolutes has opened the door to situation ethics, permissiveness, free love, sexually active youth, and a whole vocabulary of code words for adultery, fornication, perversion, abomination, and just plain sin. Junior high school through college youth, the target of humanist amoral teachings for the past 2 decades, have become vulnerable to enormous immorality. One high school principal recently admitted, 20% of our senior class has either had, or is a carrier of, a venereal disease. Surveys show that girls graduating from high school as virgins are now in the minority. Dr. Albert Ellis, along with other humanists, has long been an advocate of situation ethics. In the September-October 1969 issue of The Humanist, he is quoted as saying, "What are the main principles of humanistic ethics, from which the principles of sexual ethics can be logically derived? No one seems to know for sure, since variant and absolutistic ethical ideals do not seem to be achievable, nor are they particularly human." When a doctor of philosophy stands before students or sex education teachers and states that moral or ethical absolutes are not human, it is only natural that he will discard such precepts as "thou shalt not commit adultery." The amoral teachings of the humanists, who provide the sex education materials, movies, books, magazines, and so forth for the public schools throughout the nation, are not presented in the abstract, but in terms their students can clearly understand. Consider this advice taken from Claire Chambers's The Sika Circle on Sexual Experimentation by Sika's president Dr. Mary Calderone, who was declared Humanist of the Year in 1974 by the American Humanist Association. On sexual experimentation, the adolescent years are, among other things, for learning how to integrate sex usefully and creatively into daily living. Therefore, we must accept that adolescent sexual experimentation is not just inevitable, but actually necessary for normal development. On premarital sex, advocate discussion of it, so that young people know they have choices, beginning with masturbation, of course, and petting to climax and mutual orgasm before moving on to intercourse. On extramarital sex, an extramarital affair that's really solid might have very good results. On Sexology magazine is no more pornographic than the Bible. There is no greater evidence of the humanists' obsession with sexual license than the fact that the leaders of the sexual revolution of the 70s were overwhelmingly humanists. The sex education authors, publishers, and Sika's board members who proclaim homosexuality as an optional lifestyle to our school children are humanists. Many do not realize that most of the leaders of the feminist movement, which presents itself as the preserver of sexual rights of women and children, are humanists. Betty Friedan, for example, won the Humanist of the Year award in 1975. Tony Carabillo, past vice president of NOW, declared, "I don't think the women's movement, as such, is going to remain a women's movement. I think as more understand what we are really saying, the 10% male membership we now have will begin to swell. I think we'll stop describing ourselves as feminists and begin to describe ourselves as humanists and really begin to deal with the problems of creating a different kind of society." *degree. Don't think for a moment that the amoral humanists are satisfied, now that perversion is recognized as normal in some areas of our country. They will not stop until it is universally recognized. They are really after the young, who will be the key to humanist control of the next generation. That is why in the name of healthcare, child's rights, child abuse, and the Year of the Child they are pressuring political leaders to pass legislation taking the control of children away from their parents and giving it to the state. By the state, of course, they mean bureaucrats and social change agents who have been carefully trained in amoral, humanistic philosophy and who will use the government's power to teach sexual activity, contraceptives, birth elimination, and permissiveness to children, whether parents want it or not. Of course, government-financed abortions will be provided for those who fail to follow instructions. What morally minded people perceive as the bizarre and unbelievable actions and policies of educators, social workers, and government bureaucrats are the natural result of their basic beliefs. Consider Dr. Lamont again. Morally speaking, the sex life of an individual is no more important than his political or economic life. Morally speaking, we would add, one's actions reflect his beliefs. Lamont clarifies his ethical position as follows: for humanism no human acts are good or bad in or of themselves. Whether an act is good or bad is to be judged by its consequences for the individual and society. Knowledge of the good, then, must be worked out, like knowledge of anything else, through the examination and evaluation of the concrete consequences of an idea or hypothesis. Humanist ethics draws its guiding principles from human experience and tests them in human experience. The truly moral person will be obliged to discard the outmoded ethics of the past. The merely good is the enemy of the better. The humanist refuses to accept any 10 commandments or other ethical precepts as immutable and universal laws never to be challenged or questioned. He bows down to no alleged supreme moral authority either past or present. Asterisk. The humanist intensely rejects the puritanical prejudice against pleasure and desire that marks the Western tradition of morality. Men and women have profound wants and needs of an emotional and physical character, the fulfillment of which is an essential ingredient in the good life. Contempt for or suppression of normal desires may result in their discharge in surreptitious, coarse, or abnormal ways. The author fails to advise that suppression of normal desires may also develop character and self-discipline. Obviously, humanism not only conceives of man as an animal, but as an amoral animal. Autonomous man-womanists view man as an autonomous, self-centered, godlike person with unlimited goodness and potential if his environment is controlled to let his free spirit develop. One of the worst sins of man, according to humanists, is not the killing of innocent, unborn children through abortion, or even the murder of preemies or children born with defects, it is inhibiting the liberty and freedom of another to express himself. That man is innately good and capable of solving the problems of man independent of any supreme being is a consistent assumption of humanism's philosophy that man is the measure of all things. This concept, first coined by Protagoras, a Greek philosopher of the 5th century BC, has since become a basic tenet of humanism. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712–1778, the French skeptic, is probably a most influential writer-philosopher for today's college youth. They study him vigorously, and most humanistic college professors are well versed in his thinking. Rousseau said, "If man is good by nature, as I believe to have shown him to be, it follows that he stays like that as long as nothing foreign to him corrupts him." Incidentally, professors who eulogize this hero of the Enlightenment rarely tell their students that, in his personal life, Rousseau was a moral degenerate. For 16 years he lived outside the bounds of marriage with his mistress in Paris, who bore him 5 illegitimate sons, all of whom he abandoned in the Paris General Hospital. Humanist theorists may exalt that kind of autonomous, self-centered thinking as self-actualization at its best, but I can't help wishing that someone had preserved testimony from the victims of his selfishness, his 5 orphaned sons. Nearly 3 centuries later, the modern humanist Lamont adds to Rousseau's dictum, "What the scientific study of human motives shows is that human nature is neither essentially bad nor essentially good, neither essentially selfish nor essentially unselfish, neither essentially warlike nor essentially pacific. There is neither original sin nor original virtue. But human nature is essentially flexible and educable. And the molding or remolding of human motives is something that takes place not only in childhood and youth, but also throughout adult life and under the impact of fundamental economic institutions and cultural media that weightily influence mind and character. The social development and conditioning of human beings, their training, direct and indirect, by means of all sorts of educational techniques, can be so extensive that the hoary half-truth, 'you can't change human nature,' becomes quite irrelevant. Dr. Schaffer points out that autonomous thinking historically leads not to world betterment, or even human improvement, but to chaos. Rousseau's philosophy, for example, was a major factor in producing the French Revolution, which was not only chaos for the royalty but also for the poor people. Man is not autonomous, but dependent on God. He finds his greatest fulfillment when he is aware of that fact. Self-centered, self-sufficient man. Once man thinks he is independent of God, he becomes self-centered, suddenly he and his wants become the measure of all things. Today's philosophy of education is obsessed with self-actualization, self-sufficiency, Self-satisfaction. Consider the following: humanism is the viewpoint that men have but one life to lead and should make the most of it in terms of creative work and happiness, that human happiness is its own justification, and requires no sanction or support from supernatural sources, that in any case the supernatural, usually conceived of in the form of heavenly gods or immortal heavens, does not exist, and that human beings, using their own intelligence and cooperating liberally with one another, can build an enduring citadel of peace and beauty upon this earth. Degree. The watchword of humanism is happiness for all humanity in this existence as contrasted with salvation for the individual soul in a future existence and the glorification of a supernatural supreme being. Humanism urges men to accept freely and joyously the great boon of life and to realize that life in its own right and for its own sake can be as beautiful and splendid as any dream of immortality. Humanism asserts that man's own reason and efforts are man's best and, indeed, only hope, and that man's refusal to recognize this point is one of the chief causes of his failures throughout history. The Christian West has been confused and corrupted for almost 2,000 years by the idea so succinctly expressed by St. Augustine: cursed is everyone who places his hope in man. 8. Starting from an atheistic base, autonomous humanists emphasize feeling rather than responsibility. The idea that if it feels good, it must be good permeates the land. Did you ever try to reason with a marijuana user or drug addict or an alcoholic? Feelings predominate, for the self-centered human. The fact that he is destroying himself and his culture doesn't dissuade the humanist from doing his own thing. Dr. Schaffer points out, as the Christian consensus dies, there are not many sociological alternatives. One possibility is hedonism, in which every man does his own thing. Trying to build a society on hedonism leads to chaos. Degree. We have more selfish people living in our country today than at any other time in history, and do you know why? There are two basic reasons: the self-centered philosophy of humanism and the humanistic ideas of psychology, which have taught permissiveness in child raising, instead of parental discipline. Children raised without loving parental correction grow up to be self-centered and selfish individuals, whose attempt to be independent, or autonomous, leads them to futility, or chaos. A TV talk show host once asked me, on the basis of your counseling experience, what is the primary cause of marital disharmony today? My response was immediate: selfishness. In actuality, the root cause of all social disharmony is selfishness. An indulgent attitude toward self begets the childish "I want my way" syndrome, causing an individual to stalk through life in an undisciplined, insensitive, unbridled fashion. He will seek to get, rather than give, lust, rather than love, demand, rather than contribute. What happens when his peers act the same way? They incur dissension, hostility, even open combat. Man is a dependent creature, dependent first on God, then on his fellow man. His failure to recognize that need cheats him, both in this life and the eternity to come. Socialist one worldview womanists have a running romance with big government. They universally assume that government is good and that big government is better than little government. Their practical interpretation of democracy seems to be freedom only for the individual living within a socialist government, controlled of course, by humanists. The historical facts of life have somehow escaped their attention. That is, they overlook or reject the premise that freedom has always been in inverse proportion to the size and power of government. The less government, the more freedom, and vice versa. Anyone familiar with humanist writers is struck by their consistent hostility toward Americanism, capitalism, and free enterprise. But at the same time, they extol the virtues and benefits of socialism, without acknowledging its historical failures. Lamont, one of the chief propagandists for humanism during the last 50 years, repeatedly calls for a general disarmament or collective security. He eulogizes a government that does away with poverty, unemployment, inflation, depression, business monopoly, for until we do so there will be no lasting international peace. Degree. What he fails to point out is that this requires virtual economic control by government, in other words, socialism. To reach their goal of a socialist world order by the year 2000, they do not have time to socialize the world gradually. It must be done quickly, by force and violence, and that is communism. But that doesn't bother humanists. They are much more respectful of communism than they are of free enterprise, anyway. Consider these glowing tributes to Marxism. The dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels corrected the mechanistic errors of the earlier materialist tradition and gave full recognition to the dynamic, ever-changing character of existence and to the infinite interrelatedness of a phenomena in both nature and society. While dialectical materialism considers that human thought is a function of the bodily organism, it believes that the mind is no mere passive reflector of the outside world, but that it possesses a fundamental initiative and creativity, a power of working upon and remolding the environment through the force of new ideas. At the same time, the Marxist materialists have carried on and developed the intransigent anti-religious doctrines of the materialists who preceded them. Today there can be little question that dialectical materialism, while having its own shortcomings, is the most influential variety of materialism. Both because of its consistency and inclusiveness and also because it is the official philosophy of communist governments and parties throughout the world. The humanists discovered early that the UN offered them a tremendous springboard to a humanist one-world government with a socialistic economic system. In 1966, the Humanist magazine for July/August admitted humanism's purpose was to supersede nationalistic boundaries by a worldwide organization that would possess international sovereignty over the nations of the world. Naturally, they believe the UN provides them such a vehicle, which is why so many American leaders in the many UN organizations are committed humanists. For example, 3 leading members of the American Humanism Association have been directors general of 3 prestigious UN organizations: Julian Huxley for UNESCO, Brock Chisholm, who directed the World Health Organization, and Lord Boyd Orr, who was the head of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Claire Chambers clarifies the point further in the Sika Circle. It is no coincidence that humanists have been planted in a number of strategic positions of influence at the UN. In recent years, to carry out the goals of Huxley, Chisholm, Orr, and others. Although any number of UN agencies might be selected at random as illustrations of this, such an undertaking would require a chapter to itself. UNESCO has been singled out as a case in point. Shortly after UNESCO's founding, humanist Ashley Montagu headed the committee that drafted UNESCO's 1950 Statement on Race. Further, various UNESCO publications are generously seasoned with humanist rhetoric. 2 prime examples are UNESCO's quarterly journal, Impact of Science on Society, founded in 1952 by American Humanist Association official Dr. Gerald Wendt, who was then in charge of worldwide development of science education for UNESCO in Paris, and International Directory of Philosophy and Philosophers, co-edited by Paul Kurtz, editor of The Humanist. Other UNESCO humanist entanglements are evident. Frederick H. Burkhardt, formerly a member of the Humanists' Editorial Advisory Board, has served as chairman of the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO. But more significant is the fact that humanist Gerald Wendt was for many years president of the UNESCO Publications Center in New York City. Although Wendt is now dead, his widow continues to work in the capacity of secretary for the Publications Center. As Lamont says, a truly humanist civilization must be a world civilization. If humanists can control UNESCO, UNICEF, the UN's World Health Organization, and its Food and Agriculture Organization, they are a long way toward implementing that world civilization. If you think they haven't been very effective, you are kidding yourself. I have a 5-volume set of reports entitled Towards World Understanding, a 1950 UNESCO publication, that outlines the humanization and socialization of American education. Public education today is exactly as they planned it. In a future book, I will expose that in detail. So enthusiastic have humanists become in their zeal for a one-world order that, according to Chambers, in 1971, some of their leaders combined forces with leading advocates of population control and nationalized abortion, world federalists, and others, in the formation of the American Movement for World Government. This group's full-page advertisement in the New York Times of July 27, 1971, called for a world federal government to be open at all times to all nations without right of secession, with the power to curb overpopulation. Other essentials supported by this group of 26 Sig. Battle for the Mind. Notaries of the Times ad are a civilian executive branch with the power to enforce world laws directly upon individuals, which would automatically supersede the U.S. Constitution, and the control of all weapons of mass destruction by the world government with the disarmament of all nations, under careful inspection, down to the level required for internal policing. The latter, of course, could conceivably allow for the stationing of Russian or Chinese communist troops on U.S. soil. And, as was further stated in the ad, a federal world government must be established at the earliest possible moment by basic transformation of the UN or other reasonable means. This document was not signed by a few socialistic crazies but by the who's who of humanism. And that brings us to the important subject of patriotism, or old-fashioned love for one's country. All committed humanists are one-worlders first and Americans second. Here Corliss Lamont, the doctrinaire humanist, all individuals of all countries are together fellow citizens of our one world and fellow members of our one human family. The Americans, the Russians, the English, the Indians, the Chinese, the Germans, the Africans, and the rest are all part of the same perplexed, proud, and aspiring human race. Humanism is not only a philosophy with a world ideal, but is an ideal philosophy for the world. It is quite conceivable that a majority of this planet's population could come to see the truth of its underlying principles. The humanist viewpoint, surmounting all national and sectional provincialisms, provides a concrete opportunity for overcoming the age-long cleavage between East and West. Even those who cling to some form of supernaturalism can unite with humanists, as they did during World War II, on a program of democracy and progress that reaches to the farthest corners of the earth. Humanism is a supranational, pan-human philosophy of universal relevance. It is the philosophic counterpart of world patriotism *degree. It rejects the dead ends of despair as well as the daydreams of utopia. I believe firmly that man, who has shown himself to be a very tough animal, has the best part of his career still before him. And there is at least the possibility that by the close of this century the humanist breakthrough, in Sir Julian Huxley's phrase, will spread throughout the globe to create a higher civilization of world dimensions. If that isn't clear enough, consider another statement by Lamont: certain forms of modern nationalism fanatical, intolerant, militaristic, and contemptuous of foreign peoples amount in essence to the large-scale organization of egoism. They clearly clash with the ideals of humanism and put current meaning into Dr. Samuel Johnson's remark that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. To love one's country does not really imply that one must hate other countries or adopt the slogan "My country right or wrong." The principle around which the United Nations and the International Court of Justice are organized is that the scope of national sovereignty must be curtailed and that nations must be willing to accept, as against what they conceive to be their own self-interest, the democratically arrived at decisions of the world community. Do you believe that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel? Do your elected political leaders? If they are humanists, they do. And that is one of the chief reasons our politicians have turned the most powerful country in the world after World War II into a neutralized state. They are more interested in world socialism than in America. That is why humanist politicians permitted Russia to conquer the satellite countries of Europe and turn them into socialist prisons. That is why we were not permitted to win in Korea and Vietnam and why they voted to give away the Panama Canal. That is why Russia was allowed to turn Cuba into an armed camp with a submarine base, stationing at least 3,000 Russian troops, and who knows what else, there. No humanist is qualified to hold any governmental office in America. United States Senator, Congressman, Cabinet member, State Department employee, or any other position that requires him to think in the best interest of America. He is a socialist one-worlder first, an American second. The giveaway of the Panama Canal is a prime example of whose team is number one in the hearts of American humanist politicians. America lost on that deal, but socialist and communist countries all gained. Fortunately, that action was so flagrant that many of the legislators who voted away the canal we purchased and built are being replaced at each election. I am not saying that anyone who voted for the giveaway to the communist government of Panama is an evil person. I am asserting that the issue stands as an example of the humanist philosophy functioning in the political sphere. Their first allegiance is to a socialist one-world view, then to America. Such politicians can be counted on to vote the same way on other issues: the continuing persecution of Rhodesia, permitting Cuban troops to enslave various African countries such as Angola, breaking off relations with Taiwan, or increasing United States appropriations to the UN. A humanist is just not qualified to be elected to public office by patriotic, America-loving citizens. The major problems of our day, moral, educational, economical, and governmental, are primarily caused by the fact that over 50% of our legislators are either committed humanists or are severely influenced in their thinking by the false theories of humanism. Humanism's hostility to Christianity, the spirit of tolerance that is so often extolled in humanist teachings, does not extend to Christianity. Knowledgeable humanists look upon the Church and its doctrinal absolutes as the greatest enemy of mankind. More than an enemy, the Church is a threat to humanism, for its leaders recognize that the only group that can save the Western world from the humanistic mind control of the communist countries is the Church. If Christ's Church becomes sufficiently aroused to the fact that humanism is currently winning the battle for the mind, she will awaken the other millions of pro-moral Americans, and together they will vote their amoral humanist overlords out of office and replace them with traditional, pro-moral leaders. Consider these comments from Lamont and other humanists. Passing to the New Testament, we see plainly that its theology, taken literally, is totally alien to the humanist viewpoint in academic circles. Andrew D. White's scholarly study, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, proved of signal service to the documentation of humanism by showing that the theologians had fought practically every forward step in scientific investigation since the founding of Christianity, much to the detriment of religion as well as of science. Thinkers who claim that complete selfishness is an inborn quality of human beings are taking over and expressing in different languages one of the great errors of Christian ethics, namely, that man is inherently sinful and depraved. Christianity and humanism are particularly 180 degrees in opposition to each other with regard to the promise of life after death. Having just finished a book on that subject, detailing the carefully revealed events of the future life described in Scripture, I can appreciate the humanists' frustration. Bible-taught Christians approach death with peace and confidence, whereas humanists tend to consider that ultimate meeting with God with fear and trepidation. Humanism is a tragic philosophy to live by and a disastrous philosophy to die by. Consider Lamont and William James on immortality. Humanism Christianity Atheism equals 180 degrees in opposition. Man's ways are not God's ways and God's ways are not man's way. Isaiah 55:8. The issue of mortality versus immortality is crucial in the argument of humanism against supernaturalism. For if men realize that their careers are limited to this world, that this earthly existence is all that they will ever have, then they are already more than halfway on the path toward becoming functioning humanists, no matter what their general attitude toward the universe and no matter what they think about a deity. In my opinion, the history of philosophy and religion demonstrates that in the West, at least, the idea of immortality has on the whole played a more important part than the idea of God. William James asserts unqualifiedly that the popular touchstone for all philosophies is the question, what is their bearing on a future life? If this is true, then James is also correct in observing that for most men God has been primarily the guarantor of survival beyond the grave. Christianity in particular, with its central emphasis on the resurrection and eternal life, came into being first and foremost as a death-conquering religion. Consider once again rejection of Christianity and its naive replacement. Humanism is the viewpoint that human happiness is its own justification and requires no sanction or support from supernatural sources, that in any case the supernatural, usually conceived of in the form of heavenly gods or immortal heavens, does not exist, and that human beings, using their own intelligence and cooperating liberally with one another, can build an enduring citadel of peace and beauty upon this earth. One of the greatest complaints of humanism against Christianity is the supposed censoring of artistic creativity. Narrowly moralistic restraints on artists and writers have ever been a bane in the history of the West, and those restraints have frequently stemmed from the supernaturalist's suspicion of earthly pleasures. As Professor Erwin Edman explains, the traditional quarrel between the artist and the Puritan has been the quarrel between those who were frankly interested in the sensuous appearances and surfaces of things and those to whom any involvement or excitement of the senses was a corruption of the spirit or a deflection of some ordered harmony of reason. The history of censorship in the fine arts, if it could be told in full, would be found to revolve in no small measure around the assumed peril of corruption of the spirit by the incitements of the flesh through beautiful things. Degree. Simply interpreted, the artist, because he is an artist, must be free to draw his own thing, whether it be an impressionistic blob or a pornographic appeal to the sensual nature. God says, "Thou shalt not," humanism says, "Thou shalt." The humanist's faith in man and his inherent goodness stands in marked contrast to the Christian position of the fall. As Lamont admits, humanism assigns to man nothing less than the task of being his own savior. As any Christian knows, man can never save himself. He lost paradise of his own volition, but he lacks the power and authority to reclaim it. Yet another humanist, John Galsworthy, would dare to claim, humanism is the creed of those who believe that in the circle of enwrapping mystery, man's fates are in their own hands, a faith that for modern man is becoming the only possible faith. If the faith in humanism reflected by the preceding statements has disturbed you, consider the following theory advanced by Lamont, who, you will remember, is an evolutionist. For a scientifically induced mutation in man may well bring into existence a more advanced species, call it Superman or what you will, that will be as superior to us in brain power as we are to the anthropoid ape. Such an outcome is certainly within the realm of biological possibility. It is frightening to consider what B.F. Skinner and humanist geneticists could do, now that test tube babies are possible if the government would permit it. Orwell's 1984 is rapidly approaching. All it takes is for Big Brother to become all-powerful. No wonder Senator Barry Goldwater has warned Americans that we cannot survive another 10 years of liberal, humanistic leadership. He really thinks it may be only 5. If that sounds pessimistic, it is only because we have been concentrating on the problems. There are abundant resources available to us, and they will be presented in a later chapter. Humanism, the wisdom of man. Summary: humanism is pro-one world America second, with an obsession to merge Western democracies, Eastern communism, and Third World dictatorships into a one-world, socialist state, where Plato's dream of 3 classes of people would be fulfilled, e. the elite ruling class at the omnipresent military, e. the masses, where there is no difference between sexes, men and women do the same work, and children are wards of the state. Naturally, the humanists will be the elite ruling class. Humanism's premise: man is basically good. His goals should be self-actualization, self-determination, and self-indulgence. Since there is no life after death, it is in man's best interest to find the good life here and now. Do your own thing, stress human rights, be lenient to criminals. Humanists advocate sexual activity and promiscuity for the young, as well as the old. They advocate free use of pornography and drugs and endorse prostitution, homosexuality, and abortion on demand in the name of human rights. Their guiding principle is do what is in your own self-interest, and they are very hostile to Christianity and morality. Humanists hold a religious theory that permits them to explain man's origin without God, thus leaving man unaccountable to God. In spite of scientific evidence to the contrary, they insist that man is the highest form of primate. They will not permit creation to be given equal time in our so-called free public schools. Humanists foster the unscientific religious belief that there is not now and never has been either a supreme being or a personal God who is interested in the affairs of man. The Humanist Manifesto's NIL what the Bible is to Christians, the Humanist Manifesto is to humanists. It represents the official position of the Humanist Advocacy Bas Lawlicius AAPPE movement and is accepted by the faithful as the current mandate on humanist beliefs, values, and goals. Its very existence, which so clearly sets forth their atheistic, evolutionary, amoral, self-worshipping, and socialistic worldviews, shows how confident humanists are in their ultimate triumph. This amazing document blueprints their takeover of the 21st century. Humanist Manifesto I was compiled by 34 liberal humanists in the United States. Many of its signers, like John Dewey, were leaders in the field of education, government, and the Unitarian clergy. Humanist Manifesto II, the 1973 update of the previous document, supersedes it, proclaiming itself a positive declaration for times of uncertainty. The following statements from the manifestos affirm their belief in the 5 basic tenets of humanism. Atheism. Religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Copyright. We find insufficient evidence for belief in the existence of a supernatural. It is either meaningless or irrelevant to the question of the survival and fulfillment of the human race. As non-theists, we begin with humans not God, nature not deity. Nature may indeed be broader and deeper than we now know. Any new discoveries, however, will but enlarge our knowledge of the natural. But we can discover no divine purpose or providence for the human species. While there is much that we do not know, humans are responsible for what we are or will become. No deity will save us, we must save ourselves. Evolution. Humanism believes that man is part of nature and that he has emerged as the result of a continuous process. Holding an organic view of life, humanists find that the traditional dualism of mind and body must be rejected. Copyright. Humanism recognizes that man's religious culture and civilization, as clearly depicted by anthropology and history, are the product of a gradual development due to his interaction with his natural environment and with his social heritage. The individual born into a particular culture is largely molded to that culture. Science affirms that the human species is an emergence from natural evolutionary forces. As far as we know, the total personality is a function of the biological organism transacting in a social and cultural context. There is no credible evidence that life survives the death of the body. We continue to exist in our progeny and in the way that our lives have influenced others in our culture. Registered amorality. We affirm that moral values derive their source from human experience. Ethics is autonomous and situational, needing no theological or ideological sanction. Ethics stems from human need and interest. To deny this distorts the whole basis of life. In the area of sexuality, we believe that intolerant attitudes, often cultivated by orthodox religions and puritanical amorality cultures, unduly repress sexual conduct. The right to birth control, abortion, and divorce should be recognized. While we do not approve of exploitive, denigrating forms of sexual expression, neither do we wish to prohibit, by law or social sanction, sexual behavior between consenting adults. The many varieties of sexual exploration should not in themselves be considered evil. Without countenancing mindless permissiveness or unbridled promiscuity, a civilized society should be a tolerant one. Short of harming others or compelling them to do likewise, individuals should be permitted to express their sexual proclivities and pursue their lifestyles as they desire. We wish to cultivate the development of a responsible attitude toward sexuality, in which humans are not exploited as sexual objects, and in which intimacy, sensitivity, respect, and honesty in interpersonal relations are encouraged. Moral education for children and adults is an important way of developing awareness and sexual maturity. It is obvious that this amoral life view is the officially endorsed position of our government and the educational system. For over 75 years, judges, legislators, governors, mayors, and presidents have introduced legislation based on this philosophy, which is destructive of morality and family solidarity. We have arrived at the gates of Sodom and Gomorrah. Autonomous, self-centered human life has meaning because we create and develop our futures. Happiness and the creative realization of human needs and desires, individually and in shared enjoyment, are continuous themes of humanism. We strive for the good life, here and now. The goal is to pursue life's enrichment despite debasing forces of vulgarization, commercialization, bureaucratization, and dehumanization. Reason and intelligence are the most effective instruments that humankind possesses. There is no substitute, neither faith nor passion suffices in itself. The controlled use of scientific methods, which have transformed the natural and social sciences since the Renaissance, must be extended further in the solution of human problems. Registered to enhance freedom and dignity, the individual must experience a full range of civil liberties in all societies. This includes freedom of speech and the press, political democracy, the legal right of opposition to governmental policies, fair judicial process, religious liberty, freedom of association, and artistic, scientific, and cultural freedom. It also includes a recognition of an individual's right to die with dignity, euthanasia, and the right to suicide. We oppose the increasing invasion of privacy, by whatever means, in both totalitarian and democratic societies. We would safeguard, extend, and implement the principles of human freedom evolved from the Magna Carta to the Bill of Rights, the Rights of Man, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The preciousness and dignity of the individual person is a central humanist value. Individuals should be encouraged to realize their own creative talents and desires. We reject all religious, ideological, or moral codes that denigrate the individual, suppress freedom, dull intellect, dehumanize personality. We believe in maximum individual autonomy consonant with social responsibility. Although science can account for the causes of behavior, the possibilities of individual freedom of choice exist in human life and should be increased. The purpose of life for the humanist contrasts sharply with that of the Christian. Religious humanism considers the complete realization of human personality to be the end of man's life and seeks its development and fulfillment in the here and now. This is the explanation of the humanist social passion. The writers fail to point out that in order to grant such unbridled freedom to everyone, we must remove all restraints. In so doing, we open the door to anarchy. As we have seen, total liberty or, as they call it, democracy leads to anarchy. Americans have always preferred a government of laws, where the good of the many is preferred to the good of the individual. Otherwise, chaos will open the door to a totalitarian dictator. Democracy is a fantasy. Men must be governed by moral laws that curb their natural, fleshly, instincts and impose ethical mandates upon their activities. Without such laws, factions struggle for supremacy, society sinks into a revolutionary state, and dictatorship devours the result. Socialistic one worldview. Although the humanist prizes individual freedom and loathes external restraints, for some reason, he yearns for an international oneness of all people and seems willing to sacrifice national benefits to international unity. While we may sympathize with his endeavors to help starving masses or improve other cultures, we stand in disbelief at his naive willingness to discard the freedoms guaranteed by American legal documents, particularly the Bill of Rights, and place himself under the rule of international laws and judicial processes. Even in our own country, when we let Big Brother do it, we complain about red tape, lack of personal concern, higher prices, and overall bungling. Can't they envision the same ineptitude on an international scale? Regardless of potential disaster, hear their glowing resolution: as found in the humanist Bible, we deplore the division of humankind on nationalistic grounds. We have reached a turning point in human history where the best option is to transcend the limits of national sovereignty and to move toward the building of a world community in which all sectors of the human family can participate. Thus we look to the development of a system of world law and a world order based upon transnational federal government. This would appreciate cultural pluralism and diversity. It would not exclude pride in national origins and accomplishments nor the handling of regional problems on a regional basis. Human progress, however, can no longer be achieved by focusing on one section of the world, Western or Eastern, developed or underdeveloped. For the first time in human history, no part of humankind can be isolated from any other. Each person's future is in some way linked to all. We thus reaffirm a commitment to the building of world community, at the same time recognizing that this commits us to some hard choices. The problems of economic growth and development can no longer be resolved by one nation alone, they are worldwide in scope. It is the moral obligation of the developed nations to provide through an international authority that safeguards human rights massive technical, agricultural, medical, and economic assistance, including birth control techniques, to the developing portions of the globe. World poverty must cease. Hence extreme disproportions in wealth, income, and economic growth should be reduced on a worldwide basis. All Christians deplore world poverty. But even if it could be eliminated by world socialism, which it cannot, because socialism stultifies production. For example, socialistic Russia is still dependent on the free world for food. If it came at the expense of control by atheistic, amoral humanists, the price would be too great. Since their philosophy is only unproven theory, which contradicts historical precedent, it is obviously too dangerous a course to follow. One-worldism is substantially bolstered by the humanists' egalitarian pose. The principle of moral equality must be furthered through elimination of all discrimination based upon race, religion, sex, age, or national origin. This means equality of opportunity and recognition of talent and merit. Individuals should be encouraged to contribute to their own betterment. If unable, then society should provide means to satisfy their basic economic, health, and cultural needs, including, wherever resources make possible, a minimum guaranteed annual income. No other system has been devised that would have a more stultifying impact on creativity and human initiative. What a far cry from necessity is the mother of invention. Continuously guaranteed welfarism is the worst human demotivator ever conceived by government. The humanist's intellectual ideal of peace impels him to declare, this world community must renounce the resort to violence and force as a method of solving international disputes. We believe in the peaceful adjudication of differences by international courts and by the development of the arts of negotiation and compromise. War is obsolete. So is the use of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. It is a planetary imperative to reduce the level of military expenditures and turn these savings to peaceful and people-oriented uses. The problem with this idealism is that humanists have a basic misunderstanding of the nature of man. They consider man inherently good, whereas the Bible pictures humanity as fallen, sinful, and untrustworthy. Humanists naively envision a utopian world millennium, when all countries renounce war and man is engulfed by peace, prosperity, and brotherhood. If they would learn a lesson from history, they would find that such a utopian lifestyle has never existed and never will. Mankind must experience a change in nature before people can live together as brothers in a world of peace. The 27 dictators in Africa prove once again that ruthless man will trample the rights of the weak, if given the chance. In fact, humanist theories have made dictatorships out of these African states. Humanistic myopia cannot get one principle in focus, a one world, socialist government must select a supreme governor to make the final decisions, and such a person must be human. History shows that such leaders invariably turn out to be Stalins, Hitlers, and Mao's rigid, ruthless, iron-fisted, dictatorial. They have accounted for the deaths of over 65 million of their own countrymen. Who could possibly imagine that an international ruler would be humane in his treatment of people over whom he rules? Only an idealistic humanist. It is this socialistic, one-world bent of the humanist's mind that renders him unqualified to hold any government office in our land, particularly national government. As we shall see, however, many of our senators, congressmen, cabinet members, and particularly State Department employees during the past 40 years have been humanists. That is why America has faded from its position as the most powerful nation on earth to our present status of military inferiority to Russia. Interestingly enough, the socialist viewpoint does not represent that of the American people, but only that of 600 or so humanists in the above-mentioned categories, who have molded the foreign policy of our country since the 1940s. Our forefathers rebelled at taxation without representation. It is time that 175 million or more pro-Americans in this country go to the polls and vote out of office the 600 humanists whose socialistic viewpoints misrepresent them. The anti-biblical hostility of humanism, like the other statements of humanists, the Humanist Manifesto, is quite clear in its denunciation of traditional religious beliefs. The time has come for widespread recognition of the radical changes in religious beliefs throughout the modern world. The time is past for mere revision of traditional attitudes. Science and economic change have disrupted the old beliefs. Religions the world over are under the necessity of coming to terms with new conditions created by a vastly increased knowledge and experience. Battle for the mind. We believe, however, that traditional dogmatic or authoritarian religions that place revelation, God, ritual, or creed above human needs and experience do a disservice to the human species. As in 1933, humanists still believe that traditional theism, especially faith in the prayer-hearing God, assumed to love and care for persons, to hear and understand their prayers, and to be able to do something about them, is an unproved and outmoded faith. Salvationism, based on mere affirmation, still appears as harmful, diverting people with false hopes of heaven hereafter. Reasonable minds look to other means for survival. Promises of immortal salvation or fear of eternal damnation are both illusory and harmful. They distract humans from present concerns, from self-actualization, and from rectifying social injustices. Modern science discredits such historic concepts as the ghost in the machine and the separable soul. Registered degree today. Man's larger understanding of the universe, his scientific achievements, and his deeper appreciation of brotherhood, have created a situation which requires a new statement of the means and purposes of religion. Such a vital, fearless, and frank religion capable of furnishing adequate social goals and personal satisfactions may appear to many people as a complete break with the past. While this age does own a vast debt to traditional religions, it is none the less obvious that any religion that can hope to be a synthesizing and dynamic force for today must be shaped for the needs of this age. To establish such a religion is a major necessity of the present asterisk. Humanism's goals the next century can be and should be the humanistic century. Dramatic scientific, technological, and ever-accelerating social and political changes crowd our awareness. We have virtually conquered the planet, explored the moon, overcome the natural limits of travel and communication. We stand at the dawn of a new age, ready to move farther into space and perhaps inhabit other planets. Religious humanism maintains that all associations and institutions exist for the fulfillment of human life. The intelligent evaluation, transformation, control, and direction of such associations and institutions with a view to the enhancement of human life is the purpose and program of humanism. Certainly religious institutions, their ritualistic forms, ecclesiastical methods, and communal activities must be reconstituted as rapidly as experience allows in order to function effectively in the modern world. Do you see what they are really saying? The humanists want to control the lives and destinies of the world's peoples, and they intend their takeover by the 21st century. What they fail to realize is that if they so disarm and destroy the United States that we become vulnerable to a communist overthrow, they would be among the first people the communists would eliminate. Humanist ideals are permissible in a republic that guarantees freedom of expression, but they are even now unacceptable thought forms in totalitarian Russia, China, or Cuba. If you don't believe that, ask the 12 million political prisoners in the Gulag archipelago. The tenets of humanism described in the two humanist manifestos are not the weird ideas of a few obscure imbeciles unworthy of our consideration. They are the religious beliefs of some of the most influential people in America. Educators lead the list, many of whom are heads of universities or college departments that mold the thinking of those who become the teachers of our school children. Over 160 leading humanists signed the original Humanist Manifesto IJ. Still others were added through the years, until now there are well over 200 who officially recognize its goals. Since its signing in 1973, humanists have consistently taught its dogma to our youth and used their influence to implement its objectives and lofty ideals. Summary of Humanist Manifesto and IL, read from bottom up. We have reached a turning point in human history where the best often is to transcend the limits of national sovereignty and move toward the building of a world community. The peaceful adjudication of differences by international courts. We believe in maximum individual autonomy, reject all religious, moral codes that suppress freedom, demand civil liberties, including right to oppose governmental policies, right to die with dignity, euthanasia, and suicide. Ethics is autonomous and situational, and stem from self-interest, favor right to birth control, abortion, divorce, and choice of sex direction. Religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. The human species is an emergence from natural evolutionary forces. We find insufficient evidence for belief in the existence of the supernatural. As non-theists we begin with man, not God. No deity will save us, we must save ourselves. Humanism is unscientific. Humanism is known by a variety of titles today: secular humanism, rationalistic humanism, religious humanism, enlightened humanism. But the favorite term used by the humanists themselves for their religious faith is scientific humanism. It appears repeatedly in all their journals, books, and advertisements. Ironically, humanism is completely unscientific. As we shall see in this chapter, not one premise of humanism will stand up to scientific investigation. It is all a zealously defended fraud. You may well wonder why many educators and people of prominence, educated by educators, freely acknowledge themselves as scientific humanists, when it is really so unscientific. The answer is that they have been brainwashed by the philosophy of humanist John Dewey, the father of progressive, humanistic, education, and his followers. If children are taught to read the word scientific humanism as soon as they are old enough to read, and humanism is consistently labeled scientific, they will believe it. In fact, long before the 50 million children in our American school system are old enough to understand humanism or begin to examine it for themselves, they are convinced that it is scientific. After all, their school teachers told them it was. Honest educators within our present humanistically controlled school system must answer one question: is teaching young people that which is unscientific, as if it were scientific, education or brainwashing? Until the many objective educators still in the public system awaken to the fraud they are perpetrating in the name of education, the humanists in the SYS-TEM will continue to dominate them and force them to disseminate unsupported and unscientific dogma. Academic freedom in public education only means freedom to teach humanism. The humanists will not even permit the school premises, paid for by taxpayers, to be used to teach anything Christian or biblical. What is the reason? They are afraid that an alter-hate view will reverse the brainwashing process before graduation day. True science, assured of its facts, welcomes alternate viewpoints, for truth is sharpened by exposure. Humanists know that their theories rest on unsupported propaganda, not scientific fact. That is why they become so emotional when confronted by a creation scientist who knows as much about evolution as they do but doesn't believe it. Currently, the humanists are becoming quite agitated about the success of the creationist movement in getting fair-minded school systems to insist that scientific creationism be taught, along with the theory of evolution in our public schools. It is absolutely incredible how paranoid and emotional some PhDs can get at the very thought of giving equal time to creation, the oldest and best model of origins. For 30 years, they have had it all their way, teaching only evolutionary theory. Being forced to give equal time to creation unnerves them. Legislators in the state of Georgia voted to require that creationism be taught along with evolution, as an alternate model for students to choose from. Parents favored it, taxpayers supported it, and the legislators ordered it. But who balked? The high priests of education, of course. They as such as told the legislators to keep their noses out of the education business. In recent years, that has been the response of educators when confronted by parents and others over such things as radical sex education, values clarification, or morals modification, unisex teachings, and creation. Dole out money for good salaries and costly buildings, textbooks, and educational services, and give us the minds of your children but don't tell us how to teach them. The fact that their educational experiments have resulted in the drastically lowered achievement levels of our youth doesn't bother them, and they can't understand why parents are upset. The only arrogance that exceeds that of some educators is that of the Ayatollah Khomeini, and both are after the same thing: mind control. Christianity equals science, humanism equals chaos. The present chaos in secular education, the cost of education has increased 8 times in 20 years, while the level of education has gone down, is the typical result of humanism. It is not only wrong and unscientific, but downright harmful. And the more influence humanism exercises upon our culture, the more chaos it will produce. Paradoxically, the humanists have taught that Christianity is religion in their words, a myth. Humanism, of course, does not deal with myth, for it is dedicated to facts. Consequently, humanists have divided all thought into 2 categories, the theological, or mythological, and the scientific. Since they do not rely on theology, they have decreed and widely disseminated the idea that Christians are unscientific, while they are scientific. So thorough were the humanists in this tactic that, from the 1930s to the late 1950s, most Christians suffered from what I call a false intellectual inferiority complex. In actuality, Christians have been the pioneers of education in the Western world, particularly in America. However, Christian educators have invested themselves in humanitarian activities and the preaching of the gospel, while the humanists of the past 100 years have been working increasingly for mind control, by as summing command of our government, education, commerce, the media, and in some cases, liberal churches. Only in the past 20 years have Christian men of science come out of the woodwork. They have founded several creationist organizations, such as the Creation Research Center, with over 600 members, as compared to only 170 signers of the Humanist Manifesto. Christian colleges have grown tremendously in the past 3 decades, and many of their scholars have gone on to secular graduate schools with such thorough undergraduate training in biblical truth that they have remained uncorrupted by humanist brainwashing. This groundswell of Christian scholarship, which is antagonistic to humanism, has served as the catalyst for many new books, magazines, and movies that are exposing humanism for the fraud it really is. Such disclosures, generated and disseminated at a time when the theories of humanism are proving themselves to be socially chaotic, are creating a tidal wave of national concern that has frightened the humanists. They realize that if enough pro-moral, pro-American, and Christian citizens become informed of the danger implicit in their unscientific theories, they will be voted out of office and the real American people will regain their country and culture. Humanists love to identify the great scientists of the past as either humanists or their forerunners. Particularly, they wish to claim credit for both the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. What they fail to point out is that the freethinkers, the forerunners of atheists and ultimately of the humanists themselves, were predominantly in the theoretical and abstract fields of philosophy, economics, humanities, and behavioral studies. Few of them will be found in the concrete fields of true science. The truth of the matter is that the advanced educational level and technological revolution unique to the Western world, until a few years ago, would never have occurred, had it not been for the fact that the Industrial Revolution was shaped predominantly by men who believed in God. That is important, because theistic scientists assumed a nature that was designed to follow dependable laws. Atheistic humanists, obsessed with unguided and continual change, would have had us back in the Dark Ages, where they were still attempting to trial and error their theories. Dr. Francis Schaeffer points out that even many secular scientists acknowledge science's debt to Christianity rather than to humanistic theories. Indeed, at a crucial point the scientific revolution rested upon what the Bible teaches. Both Alfred North Whitehead, 1861–1947, and J. Robert Oppenheimer, 1904–1967, have stressed that modern science was born out of the Christian worldview. Whitehead was a widely respected mathematician and philosopher, and Oppenheimer, after he became director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton in 1947, wrote on a wide range of subjects related to science, in addition to writing on his own field on the structure of the atom and atomic energy. As far as I know, neither of the two men were Christians or claimed to be Christians, yet both were straightforward in acknowledging that modern science was born out of the Christian worldview. Oppenheimer, for example, described this in an article on Science and Culture in Encounter in October 1962. In the Harvard University Lowell Lectures entitled Science and the Modern World, 1925, Whitehead said that Christianity is the mother of science because of the medieval insistence on the rationality of God. Whitehead also spoke of confidence in battle for the mind, the intelligible rationality of a personal being. He also says in these lectures that because of the rationality of God, the early scientists had an inexpugnable belief that every detailed occurrence can be correlated with its antecedents in a perfectly definite manner, exemplifying general principles. Without this belief, the incredible labors of scientists would be without hope. In other words, because the early scientists believed that the world was created by a reasonable God, they were not surprised to discover that people could find out something true about nature and the universe on the basis of reason. Dr. Schaeffer further clarifies that, while not all the scientists of the Age of Enlightenment were committed Christians, all lived in what he calls a Christian consensus. Consequently, their theories were heavily influenced by a universe of order and design, even if they personally did not believe in a designer. Living within the concept that the world was created by a reasonable God, scientists could move with confidence, expecting to be able to find out about the world by observation and experimentation. This was their epistemological base, the philosophical foundation with which they were sure they could know. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, how we know, or how we know we can know. Since the world had been created by a reasonable God, they were not surprised to find a correlation between themselves as observers and the thing observed, that is, between subject and object. This base is normative to one functioning in the Christian framework, whether he is observing a chair or the molecules which make up the chair. Without this foundation, Western modern science would not have been born. Here one must consider an important question: did the work of the Renaissance play a part in the birth of modern science? Of course it did. More than that, the gradual intellectual and cultural awakenings in the Middle Ages also exerted their influence. The increased knowledge of Greek thought at Padua University, for example, opened new doors. Certainly, Renaissance elements and those of the Greek intellectual traditions were involved in the scientific awakening. But to say theoretically that the Greek tradition would have been in itself a sufficient stimulus for the scientific revolution comes up against the fact that it was not. It was the Christian factor that made the difference. Whitehead and Oppenheimer are right. Christianity is the mother of modern science because it insists that the God who created the universe has revealed himself in the Bible to be the kind of God he is. Consequently, there is a sufficient basis for science to study the universe. Later, when the Christian base was lost, a tradition and momentum had been set in motion, and the pragmatic necessity of technology, and even control by the state, drives science on, but, as we shall see, with a subtle yet important change in emphasis **. Men of faith and men of science. Francis Bacon, 1561–1626, is called by Dr. Schaffer the major prophet of the scientific revolution. A lawyer, essayist, and Lord Chancellor of England, he stressed careful observation and a systematic collection of information to unlock nature's seria. He took the Bible seriously, including the historic fall. Johannes Kepler, 1571–1630, a German astronomer known as the father of modern astronomy, was the first to show that the planet's orbits are elliptical, not circular. His faith is clearly expressed in the preface of his book The Mystery of the Universe. Since we astronomers are priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature, it befits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather, above all else, of the glory of God. Registered Robert Boyle, 1627–1691, known as the father of modern chemistry, was renowned for his careful observation. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, Boyle viewed nature as a mechanism that had been made and set in motion by the Creator at the beginning and now functioned according to secondary laws, which could be studied by science. He stressed that the scientific research helped to reveal the greatness of the Creator. Registered though a member of the Royal Society and a dedicated scientist, he was equally committed to propagating the gospel abroad, translating the scriptures into Irish and Turkish, and writing material on the harmony of his scientific and Christian positions. Even the endowment provided in his will for the Boyle lectures stipulated that they persist for proving the Christian religion against notorious infidels. Sir Isaac Newton, 1642–1727, is famous for his discovery of the law of gravity. However, we often forget that he also invented calculus and in 1687 published the Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which became one of the most influential books in the history of human thought. By experimenting in Neville's Court in Trinity College at Cambridge University, he was also able to work out the speed of sound by timing the interval between the sound of an object which he dropped, and the echo coming back to him from a known distance. Throughout his lifetime, Newton tried to be loyal to what he believed the Bible teaches. It has been said that 17th-century scientists limited themselves to the how without interest in the why. This is not true. Newton, like other early scientists, had no problem with the why because he began with the existence of a personal God who had created the universe. In his later years, Newton wrote more about the Bible than about science, though little was published. Humanists have said that they wish he had spent all of his time on his science. They think he wasted the hours he expended on biblical study, but they really are a bit blind when they say this. As Whitehead and Oppenheimer stressed, if Newton and others had not had a biblical base, they would have had no base for their science at all. Blaise Pascal, 1623–1662, a brilliant mathematician, invented the barometer and is considered by some a major writer of French prose. An outstanding Christian, he emphasized that he did not see people lost like specks of dust in the universe, which was now so much larger and more complicated than people had thought, for people as unique could comprehend something of the universe. People could comprehend the stars comprehend nothing. And besides this, for Pascal, people were special because Christ died on the cross for them. Michael Faraday, 1791–1867, never had the benefit of formal education, yet he invented the electric transformer, motor, and generator. He developed the concept of electromagnetic fields. He engaged in experimental organic chemistry by separating benzene from heating oil. Faraday was a Christian who belonged to a small religious order that believed the Bible, and that alone, with nothing added to it nor taken away from it by man, is the sole and sufficient guide for each individual, at all times and in all circumstances. Faraday's scientific but thoroughly Christian search for truth was based upon faith in biblical creation and salvation through Jesus Christ. James Clerk Maxwell, 1831–1879, a physicist, is one of the most respected men of science. A man who extended Faraday's research in magnetic fields and electricity, he united the concept of force fields, forces acting through a distance, into a set of 4 equations. His electromagnetic theory was instrumental in advancing experimentation in optics and electronics. Raised in a Christian home, by 8 years of age, he had memorized all 176 verses of Psalm 119. Maxwell lived during the period of Charles Darwin, when evolutionary faith was spreading rapidly. He saw through this counterfeit to true faith immediately, and opposed it. Space does not permit us to include the many other scientists of faith, such as Humphrey Davy, Samuel Morse, James Joule, William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, and the hundreds of competent men of science today who believe in a personal God of design and order and who reject the false claims of atheistic humanism and its brain children, evolution and amorality. For additional information on the unscientific theory of evolution, write the Institute of Creation Research, 2100 Greenfield Drive, El Cajon, CA, 92021. All scientists have not been men of faith, but those who founded true scientific research were largely men of faith or those who were influenced in their thinking by the Christian consensus. The belief that God the lawgiver has incorporated basic laws within his universe that are discoverable and dependable has contributed largely to the development of modern science. Not until what Dr. Schaffer calls the age of modern science did a number of scientists begin to sink into skepticism, atheism, amorality, and socialism. In Europe, humanists gradually took over the educational system and fabricated a false science, built on the discoveries of men of faith in an orderly universe but attributing those findings to change and change. Today the educational takeover by humanists makes it all but impossible for those untaught in the Bible to distinguish between true science and humanistic theory, for all are called scientific by the humanists. That is one of the main reasons they expelled the Bible from the public schools in 1957. Since then, it has become fashionable to teach our youth, in addition to unscientific humanism, such things as transcendental meditation, TM, the occult, witchcraft, and virtually anything students wish to study except the Bible. Why? Because the Bible will expose humanism as a fraud. Nothing else will. Humanism's 5 unscientific basics. In Chapter 3, we established the 5 basic tenets of humanism from their own prominent writers, and in Chapter 4, we reviewed the religious precepts from their official Bible, Humanist Manifestos I and II. Now we shall demonstrate that this religious belief, masquerading as science, is so fraudulent that not one of its 5 basic tenets can be proved. In fact, measurable statistics and evidence contravene humanistic doctrine. Atheism: if a man came to town saying, "No 1 plus nothing, times blind chance, equals everything," we would say he was crazy, because he would expect us to believe that effect can be achieved without cause and design without a designer. But if he came to town displaying an academic degree and proclaimed, "Educated people do not believe in God. Instead, they believe that by chance this world evolved over millions of years, and we, like our animal brothers, are the product of spontaneous life," he is acclaimed a great thinker and called a humanist. In actuality, neither the Christian nor the humanist can scientifically prove the existence or non-existence of God. That is, the inductive method is useless in such an endeavor. the universe is so vast and so complex that it literally staggers the mind of all men, both humanist and Christian. Since God, if he exists, would of necessity have to be superior to his creation, he would essentially have to be greater than not only man, but all of his creation, the earth, the other planets, and the universe. He obviously is not discernible with the human eye, for then any controversy related to his existence would cease. Therefore, we conclude that it is impossible to prove empirically whether God exists or does not exist. Since the non-existence of God is unprovable, it is unscientific to dogmatically deny that he exists, particularly when there is ample circumstantial evidence to the contrary. Man does not have to verify things with his five senses, to conclude that they are real. Have you ever seen gravity, electricity, or love? Yet they exist, and their reality is provable by what they do. When we see light emanating from a bulb, we know that the electricity is on, although we have not observed it in its essential form. When a mother declares that she loves her baby, we cannot see her love. But when she throws her body in front of certain death to save the life of her child, we know, by what she does, that she loves. So it is with God. We do not see him, but we observe his works everywhere. The 120 trillion brain connections in your head loudly proclaim a designer. The capillaries in your body, which, if laid end to end, would wrap 5 times around the earth, are in such synchronized working order that they carry blood, nutrition, and oxygen to your entire body. Did they get there by blind chance? Since we must accept either creation or evolution by faith, it seems more logical to believe that a designer planned and created mankind. So it is with mountains, streams, stars, and everything in this world. They are effects that demand an almighty cause. Another bit of evidence we must consider in our attempt to validate the existence of God is the Bible, the oldest and most amazing book in the world. Written over a period of 1,600 years by more than 40 different people, it has a supernatural consistency about it. No other book has been so loved, so hated, so persecuted, or so used as the Bible. From beginning to end, it renders a persistent message: there is a God, he is the uncaused cause of all things, and he loves man very much. 1900 years ago, this book was completed, never to be corrected or updated. Its pages contain many signs of the supernatural, such as hundreds of prophecies that have historically been fulfilled. Its archaeological accuracy is acclaimed to be incredible. To those who have studied it carefully, it bears all the signs of what it claims divine authorship. If you hesitate to accept that bit of evidence, let's consider the alternative that the humanists have to offer. Their belief is relatively new, about 300 years old, as compared to over 6,000 years for the scriptures. In 1933, they codified their first version of the Humanist Bible, Humanist Manifesto I. In 1973, they updated it and clearly stated that it was not complete but is open for future revision. It would be hard for anyone to weigh both sides of the evidence and conclude with the humanists that there is no God. They cannot muster any scientific proof for his non-existence to counterbalance the many evidences of his existence. They certainly cannot offer a single illustration to prove that anything has ever come into existence without a designer. The truth is, atheism is unscientific. Evolution. The biggest hoax of the 19th and 20th centuries is that evolution is a scientific fact. Admittedly, it is a widely accepted theory of man's origin, held chiefly by those who reject a belief in God, but theories are not accepted as scientific fact until they can be proved. Remember, the hypothesis that traces man's lineage back to the amoeba has never been substantiated, and there is increasing evidence to the contrary. Not only do the 600 Creation Research Society scientists referred to earlier reject the idea that evolution is a fact, but many non-theistic scientists admit to a startling lack of evidence. In Chapter 4 we cited several sources, beginning with Thomas Huxley, who admitted that evolution was only a hypothesis. Dr. Clark acknowledged that there are no missing links and no substantial evidence for evolution. Creation obviously occurred before anyone was around to witness the incident. Consequently, it is impossible to verify its occurrence by witnesses. In fact, the best evidence for evolution should appear in fossils embedded in rocks, but so many questions arise in this study, paleontology, that even many evolutionary paleontologists put little stock in the record of the rocks. Besides, all such formations can be accounted for by a universal flood, which both the Bible and modern archaeology substantiate. Basing one's belief in evolution on geology or paleontology, therefore, can scarcely be considered scientific. Dr. Robert A. Millikan, a physicist and Nobel Prize winner, stated in a speech before the American Chemical Society, "The pathetic thing about it is that many scientists are trying to prove the doctrine of evolution, which no science can do. My first experience with evolution probably best illustrates why such an unscientific theory is accepted as fact by so many. In my junior high school biology textbook, I saw with my own eyes a picture of the missing link. As a matter of fact, I saw 4 of them, photographs of the Java man, the Piltdown man, Pithecanthropus erectus, and Peking man. These photos of man-like creatures really shook my faith in the Bible, which fulfilled the humanist intentions of the authors. I have since discovered that for many humanists, truth is not right as opposed to wrong, but whatever advances the humanist cause. Subsequent research disclosed that all 4 of those missing links were frauds, nothing more than 1 or 2 bones or teeth of humans. Piltdown was just an ordinary ape bone. From these few particles, the scientists or educators made plaster of Paris models, photographed them and put them in our science textbooks. For additional information on the hoaxes of the missing links, see Dr. Duane Gish's book, The Fossils Say No. Available through Institute for Creation Research, 2100 Greenfield Drive, El Cajon, CA 92021. They fully did the work they were intended to do, brainwashing millions of children with the scientific theory of evolution. Is it any wonder that so many Americans believe that man descended from monkeys, even though not one scientific fact can prove such a distorted claim? The humanists want us to believe that a great miracle, spontaneous life, happened millions of years ago, and that life, contrary to any observable scientific evidence, developed into higher and higher forms, until man resulted. This is the scientific theory that causes them to think man will continue to get better and better in the future. Evolutionists, then, want us to believe something that happened several million years ago, a biological accident, which man in his most technologically advanced laboratories cannot reproduce today. The process of evolution demands a miracle, in fact, several miracles. Dr. Richard Bliss, professor of biology and science education at Christian Heritage College, has asserted, the miracles required to make evolution feasible are far greater in number and far harder to believe than the miracle of creation. Degree if it takes a miracle or miracles either way. It seems more scientific to believe that those miracles were performed by a miracle worker with infinite intelligence. After all, everyone acknowledges that the universe reveals infinite design. The theory of evolution is based on faith, not fact. By contrast, science is the study of fact. Therefore, evolution is unscientific. Amorality during my lifetime, the new morality, as vigorously advanced by humanists, has overturned centuries of moral values and virtually created a new lifestyle for millions of people, particularly those under 30 years of age. That is not to say that preceding generations were moral purists. I spent 2 years in the Air Force, including 1 year in Germany, so I know better. But back then, an adulterer or fornicator was immoral. Today's generation is amoral. What is the difference? Conscience. Amorality: only animals, prostitutes, and moral degenerates could sleep around, bed hop, or practice free love without feeling guilty about it, in past generations. But the new morality, spawned in the creative minds of the God-rejecting humanists, is presented as science. Since it appeals to the baser appetites of mankind, giving him clinical or academic approval to practice his urges and guaranteeing that there are no absolutes. It silences his conscience by education. A human being whose conscience has been killed is amoral. Consequently, he is capable of performing like the animal he considers himself, that is, he can be inhumane. If you deem that an exaggeration, you have forgotten that the humanistic doctors and psychiatrists of the Third Reich advocated and practiced euthanasia, the killing off of those considered unfit to live, before Hitler made it state policy. The Germans could easily practice genocide against the Jews, because they had made a practice of eliminating the weak, old, and unwanted in the name of euthanasia before 1940. Consider abortion for a moment. Nothing shows the amoral influence of humanism on modern thought like the 1973 decision of the United States Supreme Court to legalize abortion. How could the majority of that august body of judges come to such a lowly evaluation of human life as to decide that the unborn is a non-person? Expert, humanistic, medical opinion led these judges to make their decision. As Dr. C. Everett Koop noted at a Schaffer seminar, I find it hard to understand why biologists have no trouble recognizing life in worms, frogs, rats, and rabbits, but medical doctors have a difficult time determining when life begins in the highest form of life, human beings. Since 1973, over 8 million abortions have been performed in America. At this rate, we will soon have to apologize to Adolf Hitler. Those who favor abortion on demand are not necessarily humanists, but they certainly have been influenced by humanism's inadequate view of human life. The Bible sets a premium on human life, as illustrated by the fact that God gave His only Son for mankind. Jesus told us that life was worth more than the whole world, Matthew 16:26. Therefore, anyone who favors abortion does not reflect a biblical view of life, but shows the influence of humanism on his thought process. Such individuals should not be in charge of our government, nor should they have access to the impressionable minds of our young. Anything that takes 8 million lives can hardly be called scientific or humane. Amorality leads to misery. The big lie of amoral humanists is that sexual promiscuity or any form of immorality leads to happiness. Self-gratification may lead to immediate pleasure, but invariably it sacrifices the permanent on the altar of the immediate. The Bible teaches, "Happy is he that hears the word of God and keeps it," see Luke 11:28. History proves that to be true. Greece, Rome, and 18th century France were sexually free, liberated and democratic, but they destroyed their own culture with their sin. Individually as well as nationally, fleshly self-indulgence breeds misery. Lest you think it can't happen here, consider the December 30, 1979 United Press story in the San Diego Union. High school pupils find life empty, joyless, a study says. Young people in affluent U.S. suburbs view their lives as empty and meaningless and get their pleasure from sex and drugs and consider school unpaid labor. The main problem those young people face is a lack of meaning in their lives, said a Putzers University sociology professor, Dr. Ralph W. Larkin. A survey I conducted of 3,400 Christian married people revealed the highest sexual satisfaction level of any survey to date. It also showed that those who were virgins at the time of marriage registered a higher satisfaction level than those who were not. Humanists teach just the opposite. The response to my book The Unhappy Gays even surprised me. My counseling of homosexuals had convinced me that they were anything but gay, experiencing more loneliness and heartache than normal people and sustaining a higher incidence of suicide. I expected to get quite a bit of hate mail and I have received some, but to my surprise, the homosexuals themselves have responded favorably by 10 to 1. Only a blind humanist will reject the fact that perversion leads to wretchedness. One man, the superintendent of a 14,000-acre park in one of the nation's largest cities, read the book and shared with one of my associates that the people in his park naturally congregated into 4 groups: Hispanics, blacks, Caucasians, and homosexuals. His comment was quite revealing. Through the years, the only area from which we have to haul out the bodies of suicide victims is the homosexual section. One need not be a scientist to deduce that homosexuality does not produce happiness. It is really a shame that humanists can't be forced to take the responsibility for their faulty teaching that homosexuality is gay or just as good as straight. This simply is not true, and it isn't scientific. Sweden the miserable. Objective-minded observers are concerned that the humanists who run our federally controlled school system are not learning a lesson from Sweden. Back in the early 1960s, Sweden was presented as the ideal society: humanist, sexually liberated, and socialist. A number of our sex education courses were modeled after theirs. Currently, reports from that former beautiful land of the Vikings reveal that it has the highest suicide rate in the world. VD and drunkenness are rampant, and the people have lost all hope for change. A recent TV documentary presented an interview with several Swedish youth, none of whom expressed any interest in getting married, having children, or securing a job. None had any hope for the future. The despair of the elderly was appalling. In fact, interviews with both young and old made clear the common dread of growing old. Senior citizens who were interviewed acknowledged an endless struggle between another meaningless, boring day of life and the legal right to commit suicide. So much for the sexually liberated, socialistic paradise of Sweden. We don't have to look to other countries, however, to refute the unscientific claims of humanism that immorality leads to happiness. All we have to do is ask the young men who are impotent due to venereal disease, or the girls who underwent hysterectomies to save their lives from VD resulting from practicing free love. Or consider the report out of Ohio State University that indicated the divorce rate was higher among couples that had lived together at least 3 years before marriage than among those who had not. Similar failures were chalked up by the humanist-inspired communal living and wife-swapping programs of a few years back. I can remember when the high priests of humanism actually suggested that children raised in communes were better off than those raised by only 2 parents. Somehow, those scientific suggestions, which proved ineffectual and even counterproductive, are barely whispered today. The silence of sex educators on the dangers of VD to sexually active teens is not only unscientific but borders on the criminal. Dr. Rhoda L. Laurent, a practicing New York City psychotherapist with prestigious academic qualifications, has written an indictment of modern sex educators for their silence on the growing problem of cancer of the cervix among sexually promiscuous girls. In a paper entitled "The Betrayal of Youth Registered," she quoted prominent medical research pointing out the little-known fact that, at the same time WHO is pushing for contraception availability for children 10 to 14 without parental consent, doctors are discovering teenage promiscuity can increase a girl's vulnerability to cancer by as much as 5 times. Dr. Laurent stated, "One does not have to be a religious fanatic to recognize nature's message. The vulnerable immature reproductive system of the pubescent and adolescent girls is at risk of being prematurely damaged by prematurely engaging in the adult sexual activity of coitus. Moreover, multiple partners do not appear to be part of nature's design for the human species, as research on males confirms. Promiscuous boys and men risk becoming cancer carriers, giving cervical cancer to women." In 1966, Dr. Clyde E. Martin presented these findings in a paper entitled "Marital and Coital Factors in Cervical Cancer" at the annual meeting of the American Public Health Association. Dr. Martin's research revealed that women whose husbands were involved in extramarital coitus showed a much higher incidence of cervical cancer than those whose husbands were faithful. Dr. Irving I. Kessler of Johns Hopkins found that extramarital sexual practice by either the woman or her spouse is also associated with cervical cancer risk. The process is not as yet understood, but it is clear that promiscuity is the central factor. Venereal disease, once controlled, but for this generation a rapidly escalating menace, is a consequence of humanist propaganda. Dr. Laurent added another interesting comment: "Other investigators have discovered that the disease is almost non-existent in nuns, whereas there is a high rate of cervical cancer in prostitutes." Evidently, morality is good for your health, whereas amorality can shorten your lifespan. If humanists are really objective scientists, why are they silent on this subject? Why don't they mount a serious campaign to warn teenagers that promiscuity leads to cancer? The truth is, amorality does not promise a happy life. To claim otherwise is unscientific. Autonomous, self-centered man. All of the humanistic notions about man being autonomous, self-productive, and capable of solving his personal problems, as well as mankind's, independent of God, are based on the unscientific principle that man is basically good by nature. As every Christian knows, that is contrary to biblical teaching. There is none good, Mark 10:18. All have sinned, and come short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23. The heart is deceitful, and desperately wicked, Jeremiah 17:9. Even Jesus began one of his commentaries, if ye, then, being evil, Matthew 7:11. The Bible consistently assumes the sinfulness of man due to the fall. Humanists, however, repudiate the fall and demand that man be granted godlike goodness. Unfortunately for the humanist, the goodness of man cannot stand up to scientific research, as all history testifies. If man is inherently good, then he ought to reflect that goodness by the way he lives. Scientifically, then, we should have some evidence of man's goodness. Would you believe that humanists are strangely silent on this subject? Some, however, are beginning to realize that history is against their so-called scientific theory. Frederick E. Edwards, director of the California chapter of the American Humanist Association, said in a published interview in the San Diego Evening Tribune, "I have a fairly cut and dried approach I use to solve problems, although I realize it's not necessarily going to give me the right answer all the time." Humanists would decide abortion, euthanasia, and other moral questions by saying an act is right or wrong, depending on its consequences. He then gave a typically humanistic idea on how to gain happiness. What makes a man happy is the fulfillment of most of his needs. To his credit, Edwards candidly admitted, humanists no longer have the extravagant faith they had in the 17th and 18th century age of enlightenment in man's ability to create a perfect world. I think cold, hard reality has thrown cold water on some of those naive illusions. We may be finding that our powers are limited and that we're not such perfectly wonderful creatures after all. The best way to judge the quality of human nature is to exegYZYYZYYY4Z. I mean what it does when it is free and unrestrained. History proves that unrestrained man has a natural penchant for criminality and inhumanity toward his fellow man. Consider the world's kings, presidents, dictators, or governors. In our enlightened era, recall Joe Stalin, who caused over 30 million of his own countrymen to be put to death, or Mao Zedong, who killed an estimated 60 million Chinese people, or humanist Adolf Hitler, or even the presidents, vice presidents, senators, congressmen, and governors in our own country who have proved to be less than honorable or have tried to elevate themselves above the law. Scientifically speaking, unrestrained man is an embarrassment to humanist ideals. While on the subject, I must call attention to an interesting historical contrast. At the same time in history that communist dictators were exterminating both friends and foes, the 1940s and 1950s, the United States, a nation born out of the Christian consensus of the Reformation, did something unparalleled in all of history. When we had Japan and Germany in a state of helpless, unconditional surrender, instead of enslaving them, as many might have done, we restored their freedom and rebuilt them, until today they are our two strongest economic competitors. Where did that kind of goodness come from? It certainly was not the result of humanism. Even humanists admit that the strength of the United States form of government and its durability, the longest period of free elections of any country in history, is due to our unique checks and balances. That is, we do not have an autonomous president, Supreme Court, or legislature. Each is a check on the other. Where did that unique idea come from? It came from the understanding of our forefathers that human nature was not to be trusted and that man functions best when subjected to checks and balances. Our forefathers were not, of course, all Christians. But the Christian consensus of the day was so strong that they seriously acknowledged the fallen nature of man and designed history's greatest constitution around it. Man tends to selfishness, not goodness, but only the humanists refuse to see that. One would think the reports coming out of Cambodia, South Vietnam, Uganda, and South Korea would convince the humanists. But just as they refused to heed the testimony of Dr. Tom Dooley that was written into the congressional record, of Chinese and North Korean communist tortures that defy human comprehension, they refuse to concede that unrestrained man is notoriously inhumane. Actually, the unscientific naivete of the humanists seems incomprehensible to both Christians and other practically minded individuals. And the higher up in humanistic education they have gone, the more naive they seem to be. Dr. James Kennedy, highly respected pastor of the largest Presbyterian church on our continent and president of Evangelism Explosion, reports a classic illustration. While finishing the work on his Doctor of Philosophy degree at New York State University, he attended his final course with 15 other students. His peers were college deans, university professors, and high school principals. One day the discussion came around to national defense and monies being spent on armament. Seeing that there was no point of agreement, I finally said to myself, I will get a point in which everyone agrees, and then we can move on. From there, I assume that all of you would agree that there is some need for some national defense. That is, if we scrap all of our bombs, and all of our planes, and all of our ships, and tanks, and guns, and disbanded our Army and Navy and Air Force, I assume that you all would agree that it would be just a foot to see whether Russia or China got to the Mississippi. Silence. No, I don't agree with that, said one. Nor I, said another. Nor I, said a third and a fourth and a fifth. To my utter astonishment, it turned out that there wasn't one single person in that classroom that felt that Russia or China or anyone else would move one little finger against us. They were convinced that the imperialism of America was the only cause of the trouble of the world today. And if we disarmed, it would simply usher in an era of universal peace. Now, that kind of reasoning is based on the concept that basically people are good. You can see the political ramifications of that very unbiblical view of man. And even if you point out to some of these people that history clearly refutes that view, they still don't seem to be impressed. Most intelligent, pro-moral, pro-American citizens who read such an account can hardly believe that such PhDs could be entrusted with the minds of our youth. Is it any wonder that so many defectors, deserters, and draft dodgers surfaced during the Vietnam conflict? Yet we pay the salaries of those educators. Interestingly enough, the higher up a person goes on the humanistic educational ladder, the more he thinks American capitalists are the real threat to world peace, not the peace-loving communists. The working men and women of America are not confused, just their leaders. Taken a step further, the humanist, in spite of all historical evidence to the contrary, has this strange concept about man's innate goodness: the poor are good, all they need is better housing, food, and money; the rich are bad, particularly capitalists; government leaders are good. Somehow the humanist mind conceives of government leaders as immune to temptation. That is why international gangsters and murderers like Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Leonid Brezhnev, and others are readily forgiven for their savagery and are respected as great world leaders. An example of man's innate goodness was apparent for all to see on the evening news in the fall of 1979, during the destructive Hurricane David, which stormed through several cities from Florida to Louisiana. In spite of the devastation and suffering experienced by the victims of David, innately good looters swept through the ruins to take advantage of the helpless. Interestingly enough, there was no looting in the Mississippi towns struck by the hurricane, because the governor, fully aware of human nature, called out the National Guard. Humanist man failed again. If man is in fact innately good, the humanist should be able to prove it. We are still awaiting his proof. Therefore, this point in humanist doctrine, like the others, is unscientific. Socialist success fact or fable. The most dangerous of the 5 basic tenets of humanism is their theory that a one-world, socialist state would solve all the problems of the world. It taxes the credibility of intelligent people to understand how humanists can call this every area in which it has been tried: Russia, China, Eastern Europe, Africa, and Cuba. Socialism demotivates man and causes him to underproduce, plunging millions of people into a second-rate, despairing way of life. I have visited 5 communist countries: Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, East Germany, and Soviet Russia. All are light years behind us, economically. They boast of full employment, and that's probably true, but I saw many government jobs in the places we visited, such as hotels, that had as many as 3 people doing one person's work. If a state-controlled economy is so superior, why after 50 years in the workers' paradise does only one family in 50 own a car? It's because the cost is equivalent to 7 years of salary. Who in this country could afford an automobile, if he had to sacrifice his entire earnings for 7 years to pay for it? It is well known that in Russia the peasants grow better and bigger crops on their tiny, privately owned gardens than are produced on the great, government-controlled cooperatives. This year the nation that under the Tsars was known as the breadbasket of Europe has to import millions of tons of wheat from America, just to feed its people. State socialism has proved to be such a demotivating experience that even the Soviets have started to use some free enterprise policies in an attempt to increase their productivity. The only people still enamored by socialism are the idealistic humanists, who have never lived under it. One conservative economist, educated in the late 1960s and early 1970s, surprised me when I asked how he escaped the usual socialist, one-world view in his humanistic education. "I didn't," he replied. "I used to be a social liberal, but 5 years ago I took a 3-week trip to Russia. That opened my eyes. Perhaps we should send all PhDs to Russia for 3 weeks, hoping for such a cure." Unfortunately, that trip would not arrest the tunnel vision of humanists, who doggedly preserve their unscientific obsession for world socialism. Corliss Lamont, one of the most influential of humanists, exalts over the great political revolutions of modern times, including the French Revolution of 1789, the Russian Communist Revolution of 1917, and the anti-colonial revolutions in Africa. He then says of them, "These tremendous mass upheavals have transformed much of the world and have had an immense impact throughout the globe. They have opened up new pathways to mankind's achievement of a truly humanistic order." Degree 3 to this we reply, yes, they have resulted in the murder of between 100 and 120 million human beings. Africa today has 27 dictators, most of them ruthless and inhumane, although not as excessive as Idi Amin and ex-President Jomo Kenyatta. This man, remember, has served as a professor at Columbia University, teaching thousands of our educators, who in turn educate the teachers of our children. Is it any wonder that our young are being brainwashed regarding the glories of a one-world, socialist ideal? College students do not accept the thesis because it is grounded in fact, but because humanist educators say so. Here is a simple test to prove that socialism has failed to provide the freedom, liberty, and prosperity that its humanist theorists have predicted for 200 years. How many are clamoring to gain citizenship in communist countries? Rarely does anyone seek the welcome mats of the countries who feature the big armies, repress the people, and implement elaborate security systems to keep the people from escaping. If the workers' paradise is such a paradise, why doesn't it open its borders and let the people choose whether to stay or leave? Their leaders know the answer, and so do you. Humanist-inspired socialism is a scientific failure. So is who? Only one organization in America can stop the complete humanization of our nation, the Church of Jesus Christ. Unfortunately, the Church seems apathetic in its response to humanism, possibly because the wolf has so neatly hidden beneath his woolly disguise. Knowledgeable Christians will rise up against religious heresy or a curtailment of basic freedoms, but their fighting instincts do not seem to be aroused by the terms secular humanism or scientific humanism. Even though the past decade has found humanists freely admitting the religious nature of their faith, many people are still under the delusion that it is a philosophy or an academic theory, and thus worthy of consideration in tax-supported educational institutions. Under the guise of philosophy, humanism has been granted a reputable position in American society. The truth is, humanism is unmistakably and demonstrably a religion. The following 9 facts will verify that thesis and, I hope, motivate you to oppose it vigorously in your city, state, and nation. Humanists call it a religion in the November-December, 1966, issue of the official organ of the American Humanist Association, The Humanist, AP. Paired an article by the executive director, Tolbert H. McCarroll, entitled Religions of the Future. He envisioned 4 major religions in the future, and he predicted that the one designated as private humanism would be the largest religious body of the future. Lloyd Moraine, former president of the American Humanist Association, stated, "Down through the ages men have been seeking a universal religion or way of life. Humanism shows fad of becoming a great world faith.